Welcome, curious insomniacs and restless dreamers, to another installment of the At Hollow Midnight collection, your go-to destination for boring bedtime stories designed not to lull you into slumber, but to gently distract your mind with the oddly specific and the wonderfully mundane. If you find yourself enjoying these peculiar tales, do consider subscribing to the channel for more nocturnal narratives. Chapter 1. The Haunted Ledger. The year was 1687, and the air in Master Eliphalet Finch's small, meticulously organized accounting office was perpetually thick with the scent of aged parchment, lamp oil, and the faint metallic tang of ink. It was an aroma that, to Eliphalet, was as comforting and predictable as the turning of the tides, a constant companion to his life's unwavering devotion to figures, ledgers, and a painstaking, almost sacred, act of balancing book. His office, nestled on a quiet cobbled lane just beyond the boisterous sprawl of London's mercantile heart, was a sanctuary of order. Every quill was sharpened to a precise point, every roll of vellum stacked according to its date of acquisition, and every copper coin in the small locked strongbox accounted for down to the very last farthing. Eliphalet himself was a man forged from the very essence of meticulousness. Thin, with spectacles perpetually perched on the bridge of a slightly crooked nose, his fingers stained an indelible black from years of ink, and his mind a vast, intricate web of sums, debits, and credits. He found a quiet, profound satisfaction in the absolute certainty of numbers, a stark contrast to the shifting, unreliable world outside his sturdy oak door. On this particular evening, a chill had crept into the office that had nothing to do with the late autumn air seeping through the gaps in the window frames. Eliphalet hunched over the voluminous great ledger of Merchant Bartholomew Plummet, a tome as weighty as a small child and filled with the spiraling expenditures of a particularly adventurous spice merchant, shivered involuntarily. He adjusted his spectacles, dipped his quill into the inkwell, and resumed his careful transcription of a shipment of nutmeg, trying to ignore the prickle on the back of his neck. The only sound, usually, was the rhythmic scratch of his quill, the occasional soft rustle of parchment, and the distant, muffled clatter of horse-drawn carts on the main thoroughfare. Tonight, however, there was something else, something subtle. A faint, drawn-out exhalation, like a sigh made of mist, seemed to coalesce in the air directly opposite his desk. Near the towering stack of property tax assessments, Eliphalet paused, quill hovering mid-air, a perfectly formed blob of ink, threatening to mar Plummet's pristine accounts. He peered into the gloom, past the dancing shadows cast by the solitary tallow candle. "Is someone there?" he murmured, his voice a reedy whisper in the sudden silence. He expected no answer. Perhaps it was simply the wind playing tricks, or the old timbers of the building settling, as they often did with a groan and a creak. His imagination, he told himself, was playing him false. He was merely tired. The calculation of tariffs on exotic silks was always a taxing affair, mentally speaking, and he had been at it since before dawn. He blinked, rubbing a weary eye with an ink-stained finger. Then it happened. A shimmering, translucent form began to solidify directly in front of the shelves devoted to government levies and imposts. It wasn't a terrifying apparition, not in the classical sense. There were no clanking chains, no spectral shrieks, no eyes that glowed with infernal fire. Instead, it was a figure that seemed to be woven from moonlight and sorrow, vaguely human in shape, its edges indistinct, as if perpetually dissolving into the dusty air. It wore what appeared to be the faded, spectral remains of a sensible, if somewhat unfashionable, 17th-century merchant's coat, its ethereal fabric hinting at long-lost wool and sturdy buttons. And then a sound. It wasn't a wail of torment, nor a cry for vengeance. It was a moan. A deep, resonant, profoundly sorrowful moan, imbued with an almost unbearable weariness. And then, clearer this time, a word stretched out and laden with an ancient bureaucratic grief. Taxes. Eliphalet Finch. A man whose heart rate usually remained as steady as the interest rate on a well-collateralized loan, felt an unfamiliar lurch in his chest. His spectacles slipped down his nose. He had heard tales, of course, of spectral visitations, of ghosts and ghouls and vengeful spirits, but they were the stuff of tavern gossip and sensational broadsheets, never something that intruded upon the quiet sanctity of his financial rectitude. Yet, here it was, a tangible, albeit transparent, presence in his office, and it was moaning about taxes. The ghostly form floated an inch or two above the worn floorboards, its spectral gaze seemingly fixed on the ledger labeled Crown Duties and Excises, 1661,000, 1685. A faint, almost imperceptible tremor ran through its translucent frame, and another moan escaped its ethereal lips, this one laced with what sounded suspiciously like exasperation. The hearth tax, the window tax, the levies on malting barley. Unjust. Unjust, I say. The words were not spoken aloud in a human voice, but rather seemed to resonate within the very fabric of the room. A chill vibration that settled deep in Eliphalet's bones. Eliphalet, despite his terror, found his professional curiosity piqued. Unjust? He prided himself on his precise understanding of all current parliamentary acts and royal decrees pertaining to taxation. Had he missed something? Was there an obscure amendment, a forgotten clause that had truly rendered some historical levy truly egregious? He swallowed, a dry, sandy sensation in his throat. Unjust, sir, he managed to croak, his voice barely audible. To which specific assessment do you refer? If I may be so bold as to inquire. The ghost slowly, ponderously turned its hazy head towards him. Its eyes, if they were eyes, were twin pools of weary gray light, devoid of menace, filled only with an infinite, administrative despair. It drifted closer, its form shimmering, until it hovered just on the other side of Eliphalet's heavy oak desk, its spectral hand passing effortlessly through a stack of audited invoices. Another groan, longer this time, seemed to vibrate the very ink in Eliphalet's well. The imposts on imported spices, the exorbitant duties on French wines, and the sheer audacity of the land tax reassessments in '79. It stripped me bare, sir. Bare! My children cried for lack of new stockings, whilst the crown revelled in my hard-earned coppers. Eliphalet stared, his meticulously ordered mind struggling to reconcile the spectral with the fiscal. This was not the wailing phantom of a murdered victim, nor the tortured spirit of a condemned sinner. This was a ghost, it appeared, of a thoroughly disgruntled taxpayer. He knew a few of those in the living world, of course. Many of his clients considered all taxes, regardless of their nature, to be unjust. But to haunt the earthly realm solely for the purpose of lamenting past fiscal burdens seemed, well, extraordinarily boring, even by his own exacting standards of a quiet evening. It was a level of bureaucratic grievance that transcended the grave. But, with all due respect, sir, Eliphalet ventured, a strange sort of professional indignation beginning to replace his fear. The land tax reassessment of '79, while perhaps inconvenient for some, was enacted by due process of Parliament, and based on the prevailing market values of agricultural yield. As for the imposts on French wines, surely you understood the need for protective tariffs against foreign luxury goods. It was designed to bolster domestic trade. You see, he found himself lecturing a spectre on economic policy, a truly surreal experience that would, he mused, likely not be believed by anyone were he to ever recount it. The ghost let out a sound that was less a groan and more a mournful, drawn-out sigh of utter futility, a sound that conveyed centuries of unrequited tax appeals. It seemed to expand slightly, its translucent form wavering. Market values. You speak of market values, accountant. When my harvest was blighted by the ceaseless rains, and the price of corn plummeted to the depths of Hades itself, and still they demanded their pound of flesh, their shilling's worth of suffering. My soul, sir, is trapped in this purgatory of retrospective tax calculations. I cannot rest while the ledgers of my life remain unbalanced by the inequities of the exchequer. The phantom gestured vaguely towards the shelves of ledgers, its wispy arm passing through the heavy oak. It seemed to yearn for the physical books, for the tangible proof of its ancient financial injustices. Eliphalet watched, mesmerized by the sheer, unwavering focus of the specter's obsession. It wasn't the torment of unrequited love, or the agony of betrayal, but the existential dread of a poorly managed balance sheet. It was a truly unique form of spectral anguish, almost respectable in its single-minded dedication to the mundane. You mean to say, Eliphalet said slowly, processing this extraordinary revelation, that your spectral existence is bound by unresolved tax disputes? The ghost solidified marginally, its translucent features twisting into something akin to a frown, though it was difficult to discern facial expressions on a creature made of mist. Unresolved. Oh, they were resolved, accountant. Resolved in their favor always. My appeals denied. My petitions ignored. My meager savings confiscated. The very air I breathed was taxed, I tell you. My very corporeal being, when I possessed one, was a liability to the crown. The moaning intensified. A low, sorrowful hum that vibrated the glassware on Eliphalet's small side table. He half expected the crystal inkwell to shatter from the sheer weight of bureaucratic despair. Eliphalet, ever the pragmatist, found himself reaching for a fresh sheet of paper and a new quill. If this spectral individual truly believed his afterlife was contingent upon the settling of ancient tax grievances, then perhaps, just perhaps, he could offer some professional assistance. He certainly had nothing else pressing to do at this late hour, and the prospect of assisting a ghost with its fiscal woes was, undeniably, a novel challenge. It was certainly more engaging than Plummett's spice accounts, which, while profitable, lacked spiritual depth. Perhaps Eliphalet mused aloud, dipping his quill with renewed purpose. If you could specify the exact years and the precise nature of the assessments you find so disquieting, we might be able to examine the historical records. The Royal Archives are quite extensive, and while retrospective adjustments are exceedingly rare, one might, at the very least, establish a definitive accounting. For posterity, if nothing else. He looked up at the shimmering specter, a man completely absorbed in his professional duty, even when that duty involved a centuries-dead taxpayer. The ghost, for its part, seemed to momentarily pause its lamentations, a faint, almost hopeful shimmer passing through its form. It was a peculiar moment of understanding between the living and the dead, a shared passion for the absolute, immutable truth of numbers, even those concerning the most boring of earthly concerns. Chapter 2. The Taxman's Curse. The faint shimmer of hope that passed through the spectral form was almost imperceptible, a fleeting shift in the moonlight-woven figure. But Eliphalet Finch, ever attuned to the most minute fluctuation, noted it with the precision of a man balancing a ledger to the last farthing. He held his quill poised, his mind already racing through the labyrinthine pathways of historical revenue acts and excise duties. This was not merely a phantom, but a historical accounting anomaly, an unresolved entry in the cosmic ledger of fairness. The ghost, no longer simply moaning, began to coalesce slightly, its features, once vague, gaining a hint of pained clarity. It was the face of a man perpetually vexed, eternally burdened by the weight of numbers. His spectral gaze fixed on Eliphalet, a gaze that conveyed centuries of unfulfilled tax appeals. "Accountant," the ghost began, its voice still a resonant, chilling whisper that vibrated deep in the floorboards. "You speak of history, of records. Oh, the records exist. They exist to damn me. My torment, sir, began not with a grand betrayal or a wicked deed, but with the most mundane of instruments, a faulty surveying chain and the misplaced zeal of a newly appointed customs assessor." Eliphalet leaned forward, eyes wide behind his spectacles, a rapt audience of one. The candle flickered, casting grotesque, elongated shadows that danced around the office, but his focus remained solely on the transparent figure. This was, he mused, far more intriguing than the quarterly accounts of the London Haberdashers' Guild. "My name, in life, was Thaddeus Blight," the ghost intoned, and a wave of profound sorrow washed through the office, a sorrow so potent it felt as though the very air had thickened with despair. "I was a humble maltster, a man who coaxed the sweetness from barley, providing the finest grist for the alehouses of Kent. My small plot of land bordering the River Medway was barely 10 acres, meticulously documented in the parish registry since the time of my grandfather. It yielded enough, with diligent labor, to support my wife, Ilara, and our 3 robust children. We were modest, content, beholden to no one save the crown, as was proper." Thaddeus Blight drifted closer to Eliphalet's desk, his spectral hand hovering over the great ledger of Merchant Bartholomew Plummet, as if he yearned to grasp a physical object, to ground his ethereal existence in the tangible world of numbers. "Then came the year of our Lord 1679, he continued, his voice taking on a sharper edge of ancient grievance. "A year seared into my very essence, etched into the fabric of my spectral being like an unpaid ledger entry. The Crown, in its infinite wisdom and insatiable appetite, decreed a grand reassessment of all landholdings, ostensibly to ensure fairness, but truly to squeeze every last drop from the common man. A surveyor, a young man named Cuthbert Finchley, barely out of swaddling, was dispatched to our village. He was new to the trade, eager to impress, and armed with a surveying chain that I would later discover to my eternal damnation had a link subtly, imperceptibly elongated due to a manufacturing defect." Eliphalet gasped, a tiny, almost inaudible sound. A manufacturing defect in a surveying chain. The implications were horrifying. A single elongated link could throw off measurements across an entire parish, leading to incorrect acreage, inflated taxes, and widespread silent misery. This was not a mere bureaucratic error. It was a foundational flaw, a numerical poison injected into the very heart of the fiscal system. "Cuthbert Finchley," Thaddeus Blight repeated, his spectral form quivering with renewed indignation, "measured my 10 acres and declared them, with the smug certainty of the inexperienced, to be 12.5 acres. 12.5, accountant. 2.5 phantom acres, conjured from thin air in a faulty chain. My land tax, already a burden, swelled by a quarter, for land I did not possess, land that existed only as a ghost in the king's ledger." Eliphalet instinctively reached for his own perfectly calibrated measuring tape, a tool he prized above all others. The idea of a flawed measuring device in the hands of a surveyor sent a chill down his spine that had nothing to do with the supernatural. It was an affront to order, a violation of fundamental principles. But surely you appealed this, Master Blight," he stammered, his professional indignation momentarily overpowering his awe. "Such an error would be evident upon resurvey." "Appealed?" Thaddeus Blight's voice rose, a wail of bureaucratic despair that seemed to echo from the distant past. "I appealed until my tongue was raw and my knuckles bled from knocking on the doors of uninterested clerks. I pleaded with the parish magistrate. I wrote petitions to the county sheriff. I even traveled to London, selling my wife's mother's prized silver locket to pay for the coach fare, to stand before the very commissioners of the Exchequer. And what did they say, accountant? They said, "The survey is filed. The figures are entered. The Crown's assessor, Mr. Finchley, has signed his name. The ledger does not lie. The ledger, sir." My doom was sealed by an ink blot and a faulty chain. The ghost's form flickered, a cascade of silent, ethereal tears seeming to fall. Or perhaps it was merely the candle flame reflecting in the translucent material of his being. But that was not the end of my curse, Thaddeus continued, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper, as if sharing a secret of profound fiscal horror. No, the fates, or perhaps the king's tax collectors, had a cruel sense of humor. In the same year, 1679, a new excise duty was levied on superior foreign malting barley for the production of fine spirits. A reasonable tax, one might think, designed to encourage domestic production. However, a new customs assessor, a man named Percival Grubbins, known throughout the district for his particularly dense intellect and an even denser ear for distinguishing between barley grades, misinterpreted the royal decree. Eliphalet closed his eyes for a moment, picturing the scene. A familiar tragedy of administrative incompetence. He had encountered his own share of Percival Grubbinses in the living world. "Percival Grubbins," the ghost explained, his voice trembling with ghostly rage, declared my humble feed grade, domestically grown barley, destined for the common alehouse, to be superior foreign malting barley. He claimed its unusually plump kernels, a result of a brief, unexpected period of sunshine, and a new, experimental fertilizing technique I had employed matched the description precisely. My protests, my detailed explanations of cultivation methods, my offer to have my barley tasted by any brewer in Kent were dismissed. He simply wrote superior foreign on the assessment form alongside the new exorbitant duty. And once more, the ledger, once written, became unassailable truth. I was taxed out of house and home, accountant, my malt house seized, my fields forfeit, my family reduced to seeking charity, all because of 2.5 ghost acres and a batch of perfectly ordinary barley deemed superior foreign by a dullard with a pen. Thaddeus Blythe's spectral presence seemed to swell with the accumulated grievance of a lifetime and an afterlife of fiscal injustice. I died, sir, a pauper, watching my wife mend worn stockings for the children with threadbare yarn. My last breath was not a prayer, nor a loving farewell, but a strangled cry against the injustice of the Crown's figures. I died in debt, not from profligacy, not from ill fortune, but from a surveyor's bad chain and a customs assessor's idiocy. And since that day I have been bound to this earthly realm, unable to find peace, unable to cross the final veil, for my ledger, the ledger of my life, remains unbalanced. My very existence is a debt, an outstanding tax liability, marked unpaid by the spectral hand of bureaucracy. The office was silent, save for the rapid, almost frantic scratching of Eliphalet's quill. He had been taking notes, his professional brain already dissecting the components of this most unusual case. The details, no matter how absurd, were compelling. A flawed chain, a misapplied tariff, the immovable force of a filed document. It was a tragedy of numbers, a symphony of administrative error. "So," Eliphalet finally said, looking up from his paper, his spectacles perched precariously on his nose, "your spectral torment stems from what amounts to a clerical error, compounded by a faulty instrument and an assessor's misjudgment, resulting in an overpayment of land tax and an unfair levy on your produce?" He rephrased the ghost's lament into crisp, analytical terms, as if preparing a memorandum for an uninterested superior. "Precisely," Thaddeus Blythe thundered, a sound that seemed to reverberate through the very foundations of the building. "A monumental injustice. A bureaucratic blunder that condemned my soul to a purgatory of fiscal lamentation. Every new tax bill issued in this city, every moan of a living soul about the hearth tax or the window tax merely adds to my agony. For I know, with the terrible clarity of the dead, that it is all built upon a flawed foundation of numbers. The very system is corrupted by such errors, and I am its living, or rather, unliving testament. Eliphalet nodded slowly, tapping his quill against his chin. He understood. This was not a ghost seeking vengeance for murder, or lost treasure, or unrequited love. This was a ghost seeking fiscal rectification, a posthumous audit, a celestial appeal against a lifetime of perceived overtaxation. It was, in its own way, a profound and deeply relatable torment, at least to a man like Eliphalet Finch. The idea of an eternally unbalanced ledger, a soul trapped by a statistical anomaly, was far more unsettling than any rattling chains or spectral shrieks. It was a problem, a puzzle, an injustice that cried out for professional intervention. "And you believe," Eliphalet asked, his voice low and thoughtful, "that should these errors be reconciled, or at the very least, officially acknowledged, your spirit might find rest?" Thaddeus Blight's form seemed to glow, a faint, internal luminescence emanating from his translucent core. "I do not know, accountant," he whispered, a new fragile hope in his voice. "But I cannot rest while this burden persists. My accounts are not settled. My final, true balance sheet remains outstanding. Perhaps if anyone could prove irrevocably that my lands were indeed 10 acres, and my barley merely common feed grade and not superior foreign, then perhaps the celestial exchequer might grant me peace. Perhaps my soul will no longer bear the indelible stamp of tax defaulter, unjustly so." Eliphalet dipped his quill, a spark of professional determination in his eyes. This was not merely a charity case, or a spectral curiosity. This was an unaddressed historical grievance, a monumental accounting error that spanned centuries. It was, quite simply, a job that needed doing. "Master Blight," Eliphalet declared, his voice firm, the steady, unwavering tone of a man about to embark on a particularly challenging audit, "I shall endeavor to locate the records. We shall scrutinize the surveys. We shall consult the excise duties. We shall, if it is within my mortal power, balance your ledger, even if it is a ledger writ in the very dust of history and sealed by the unforgiving hand of bureaucracy. For the truth, Master Blight, lies always in the numbers, even if they must be coaxed from the spectral realm." The ghost of Thaddeus Blight, the maltster, seemed to lean back slightly, his ethereal form appearing less burdened for the first time in centuries by the sheer, unyielding weight of the figures. A silence fell over the office, a silence that felt different from before, no longer heavy with sorrow, but pregnant with the quiet, determined promise of an accountant about to embark on the most important audit of his career. Eliphalet turned to a fresh, crisp sheet of parchment, sharpened his quill to a needlepoint, and prepared to delve into the ghostly realm of ancient tax records. The hour was late, the world outside slumbered, but for Eliphalet Finch the night had just begun. He had a ghost taxes to unpick, and the spectral truth of 2.5 phantom acres to uncover. Chapter 3. The Whispering Receipts. Eliphalet Finch, a man who found solace in the immutable truth of figures, wasted no time. The spectral revelation of Thaddeus Blight, the maltster, had ignited a professional fire within him, a spark of purpose that transcended the boundaries of life and death. This was not a case of simple fraud, nor a typical accounting discrepancy. This was a historical injustice, a fiscal anomaly that demanded the most rigorous of audits, even if the client was a translucent specter and the evidence centuries old. He cleared a space on his desk, Pushing aside Merchant Bartholomew Plummett's spice, accounts they suddenly seemed woefully uninteresting in comparison, and adjusted the solitary tallow candle to cast a brighter, though still flickering, glow. The ghost of Thaddeus Blight hovered patiently, or perhaps impatiently in the quiet ethereal way of spirits, opposite Eliphalet. Its form seemed less agitated now, a faint, almost imperceptible shimmer of anticipation, replacing the deep-seated weariness that had first permeated the office. It was as if the mere promise of an accountant's rigorous scrutiny had offered a first glimmer of hope in its centuries-long purgatory. "Now, Master Blight," Eliphalet began, his voice crisp and businesslike, "we shall require the precise nature of the error. You spoke of a faulty surveying chain and a misclassification of your barley. Let us begin with the land tax reassessment of 1679. He reached for a heavy, leather-bound ledger from the shelf labeled Parish Land Holdings and Assessments, Kent, 1675–1680. The ledger was thick with vellum pages, each filled with neat, if sometimes sprawling, script, documenting the properties of every landowner in the specified Kentish parish. As Eliphalet's fingers, ink-stained and precise, brushed against the aged leather binding, a faint, dry rustle emanated from within, as if the very pages were sighing. The air in the office grew colder, not with the biting chill of the autumn night, but with a peculiar, almost melancholic coolness that seemed to carry the faint scent of damp earth and distant harvests. Eliphalet, accustomed to the mundane sense of ink and parchment, noted the shift with a professional detachment that bordered on the absurd. He opened the ledger, the binding groaning softly in protest, revealing a spiderweb of entries detailing acreage, tithes, and crown levies. "Here it is," Eliphalet murmured, his eyes scanning the closely written entries, his finger tracing down a column. "Blight, Thaddeus. Ah, here. Yes, 12.5 acres. Registered Michaelmas, 1679. Diende, Cuthbert Finchley, surveyor." He looked up at the ghost. "This is the entry you dispute?" The ghost of Thaddeus. Blight drifted closer, his translucent form momentarily obscuring the candle's flame, casting an elongated, wavering shadow on the wall. A low, mournful moan, unlike any wind through a crack in the window, resonated softly, seeming to emanate from the very fabric of the old ledger itself. 12.5. The ghostly voice whispered, a sound that seemed to be woven from countless sighs of ancient frustration. "A lie, accountant. A fiscal phantom born of a warped link and a youthful fool's haste. My ground, my blessed fertile ground, was precisely 10 acres. No more, no less." As Thaddeus spoke, Eliphalet noticed something extraordinary. The numbers 12 on the page, written in faded black ink, seemed to subtly pulsate. A faint internal glow emanating from their very core, like embers beneath ash. And then, from the edges of the page, from the very paper itself, came faint, overlapping whispers. They were not words in a human tongue, not exactly, but rather the distorted spectral echo of numbers, of measurements, of calculations long past. 10. It was 10. One whisper seemed to sigh, like a breath on the back of his neck. Another, sharper, more insistent, resonated. Finchley's chain, the link, the error. It was as if the ghost of the land itself, or perhaps the ghost of the surveyor's miscalculation, was communicating through the aged paper. Eliphalet, despite the spectral phenomena, remained outwardly calm, though an internal tremor of scientific curiosity pulsed beneath his professional demeanor. He picked up a magnifying glass, its polished brass rim glinting in the candlelight, and peered closely at the entry, as if the secret to its spectral animation might be found in the very fibers of the paper. Fascinating, he murmured, more to himself than to the ghost. The ink appears to have been applied with some pressure, suggesting the surveyor's certainty. Yet, the underlying truth seems to dispute it. He then pulled out another, older ledger. Parish Deeds and Grants, 1670. And began to meticulously cross-reference Thaddeus Blight's family name. Ah, here we are. Blight, Thomas. Richard, Thaddeus. Granted 1665 from the estate of the late Sir Alistair Witherbottom. 10 acres. Precisely. He held the older ledger up, the entry for 10 acres bold and clear, without any spectral pulsation. The original grant is unambiguous. Master Blight Pikiki. 10 acres. Your claim is substantiated by prior record. A faint, almost relieved, sigh passed through Thaddeus Blight's form, and the whispers from the parish landholdings ledger momentarily softened, as if a quiet sense of validation had settled upon them. But then Thaddeus's form stiffened slightly, and the low, persistent moan returned. But the Crown would not see it, accountant. They dismissed the ancient deeds. They trusted Finchley, the newly appointed. My pleas were as naught against the weight of his inked figures. Indeed, Eliphalet agreed, making a meticulous note on a fresh sheet of paper. He wrote, Discrepancy. Blight Thaddeus. Land assessment. 1679. Borear. 12 acres versus what? 10 acres. Root cause. Suspect surveying chain. Cuthbert Finchley. He prided himself on his concise, factual notation. Now for the matter of the barley. The superior foreign malting barley classification. He moved to a different stack of ledgers, those concerning crown duties and excise, 1675, 1000, 1685. These were thinner, filled with records of goods taxed upon import or production, with varying rates depending on their origin and quality. As he pulled out the excise duties, Kent ledger, the very air around it seemed to vibrate with a low hum, a sound that was not unlike the buzzing of 1,000 tiny, unseen insects, each one whispering a fractional sum. When he opened it to the page for 1679, a faint, sweet, sickly scent of fermented grains wafted from the brittle pages, mingling with the older aromas of the office. And from the entries, spectral voices, different from the land tax whispers, began to rise. These were sharper, more insistent, like the chiding of minor bureaucrats or the lament of merchants. 4 pence per bushel. 4 grade superior. Eliphalet found the entry for Blight Thaddeus. Monte Malster. Excise due. He read it aloud. Declared 200 bushels of superior foreign malting barley. Rate 4 pence per bushel. Assessor Percival Grubbins. He looked at the ghost, his eyebrows raised. 200 bushels, Master Blight, and declared as foreign, even though you produced it domestically? Thaddeus Blight's spectral form quivered with renewed indignation. 200 bushels of ye my own barley, grown on my own 10 acres, not 12.5, and destined for the common alehouses of Maidstone. It was a good harvest, Eliphalet, plump kernels from careful husbandry. But it was common barley, as God is my witness. Percival Grubbins, that thick-headed fool, saw my grain, saw its unusual size, and simply declared it superior foreign without so much as a proper inspection. He claimed its appearance matched the description in some royal decree, ignoring the obvious truth that it was grown a mere stone's throw from his own office, as Thaddeus spoke. The entry for 200 bushels on the ledger page seemed to swell and contract, and the number 4 pence vibrated with an agitated hum. The whispers from the page intensified, becoming more distinct. Superior, no domestic. A mistake. A gross error of classification. The king's own taxman, blind to the truth. Another whisper, more chilling, added, Grubbins, dullard, pen pusher, doomed him. It was the spectral echo of bureaucratic blunders. A chorus of forgotten grievances, all centered around a misclassified pile of barley. Eliphalet felt a peculiar sympathy for Thaddeus Blight, understanding the quiet fury of a man whose meticulous work had been so carelessly dismissed by administrative incompetence. Eliphalet carefully noted the details. Discrepancy. Blight, Thaddeus. Barley classification. 1679. Domestic versus the superior foreign quantities. Root cause. Assessor Percival Grubbins' misjudgment. He then added, after a moment's thought, possible mitigating factors. Unusually plump kernels due to improved agricultural methods as claimed by client. He smiled faintly. It was rare to have a client who could provide such detailed, if spectral, agricultural backstory. He then pulled out another volume, one he kept close for such matters. A compendium of royal decrees and excise tariffs, 1661-1685. He opened it to the section on barley and malt duties. Let us see. Ah, yes. Superior foreign malting barley, typically from the Low Countries or France, distinguished by its larger, more uniform kernels and higher protein content, suitable for the brewing of stronger, more refined spirits. And domestic malting barley, typically smaller, less uniform, used for common ales and animal feed. He read the descriptions aloud, his voice steady. The difference in appearance could be subtle to an untrained eye, Master Blight. But the distinction in tax rates was considerable. Considerable. Thaddeus Blight's voice was a mournful echo. It was the difference between solvency and ruin. The difference between my children having shoes and going barefoot in the snow. That man, that Percival Grubbins, with his dim eyes and his even dimmer wit, condemned me to beggary with a stroke of his quill and a complete lack of proper discernment. The ghostly form pulsed with an agitated energy and a faint, acrid smell, like burnt toast or frustrated ambition, briefly permeated the office. Eliphalet, ever the pragmatist, continued his systematic investigation. So we have two primary errors. The land measurement, which led to an overcharge on land tax, and the barley classification, which led to an overcharge on excise duty, both in the year 1679. Both recorded by what appear to be, with all due respect to the deceased, rather incompetent officials. He dipped his quill, his mind already formulating the arguments, the counter-calculations. He would need to find supporting evidence, perhaps even local parish records that might contradict Finchley's survey, or testimony from other maltsters about Grubbins's notoriously poor judgment. As Eliphalet worked, the whispers from the various ledgers continued, a low, constant murmur of numerical discontent. From the land registry, he heard faint, distressed sighs of acreage. False. Where is the truth? From the excise ledger, more frustrated murmurs. Grade. Wrong. Oh, the cause. The cause. It was a symphony of bureaucratic torment, an auditory landscape composed of errors and grievances. He felt as though he were not just reading history, but listening to it, absorbing the very essence of human frustration with officialdom. He found several entries from neighboring farms in the land registry, all surveyed by Cuthbert Finchley, and noted minor discrepancies, suggesting a pattern of imprecision. Some properties were slightly underassessed, others slightly over, but Thaddeus Blight's was, comparatively, the most egregious overassessment. It seemed Finchley's defective chain had a particular affinity for Master Blight's property. Similarly, in the excise ledger, Eliphalet noted a curious number of instances where Percival Grubbins had declared common domestic goods to be superior foreign or of unusually high grade, resulting in higher duties. It appeared that Grubbins had a consistent habit of over-assessing based on superficial appearance rather than true classification. Perhaps he was simply zealous, or perhaps, as Thaddeus had suggested, merely dense. "Master Blight," Eliphalet said, looking up, his spectacles glinting, "it appears your unfortunate experience was not entirely isolated. Surveyor Finchley seems to have had a general tendency towards numerical improvisation, shall we say. And Assessor Grubbins, well, his judgment of quality seems to have been consistently optimistic from the Crown's perspective." A new sound joined the chorus of whispers from the ledgers, a faint, almost ghostly chuckle from Thaddeus Blight. It was a dry, humorless sound, tinged with centuries of bitter irony. Optimistic accountant. He was a simpleton with a quill, given too much power. He took my children's bread, and Finchley, that earnest, blundering boy, measured my very future away with a faulty piece of iron. Eliphalet nodded, making another note. Pattern of error, both officials. This strengthens our case significantly. He paused, tapping his quill against his chin, eyes narrowed in thought. The challenge, Master Blight, will be to present this evidence to an entity capable of acknowledging, and dare I say, rectifying a centuries-old fiscal error. The Royal Archives are meticulous, but their clerks are not known for their embrace of spectral appeals. The ghost of Thaddeus Blight, however, seemed to gain a new, subtle luminescence. The truth, Eliphalet, the truth is all that matters. If the numbers can be rebalanced, if the ledger can be set right, then perhaps the torment will cease. Perhaps my spirit will no longer bear the indelible stain of unjustly taxed. For I tell you, Eliphalet, the burden of an unbalanced account, when that account is your very life's worth, is heavier than any chains, more chilling than any gallows. It is an eternal audit of the soul. Eliphalet felt a pang of understanding, a deep, professional empathy. To a man like him, the idea of an eternally unbalanced ledger was indeed a horror. He worked through the night, surrounded by the whispering receipts, the murmuring invoices, the spectral voices of old taxes and forgotten grievances. Each rustle of parchment, each faint shimmer of ink, told a story of financial woe, of small injustices compounding into a lifetime of fiscal torment. He was no longer just an accountant. He was a historical detective, a spectral auditor, painstakingly unpicking the threads of a bureaucratic curse that had bound a soul for centuries. The mundane details of past taxation had never seemed so profoundly important, so spiritually significant. By the time the first faint hint of dawn began to gray the edges of his window, Eliphalet Finch had meticulously calculated Thaddeus Blight's exact overpayment, accounting for every phantom acre and every misclassified grain. He had, with the help of whispering receipts, found the raw numbers of a ghost's suffering. Chapter 4. The Phantom Audit. The first pale streaks of dawn had begun to paint the London sky in muted grays and faint rose when Eliphalet Finch finally set down his quill, a triumphant, if weary, sigh escaping his lips. He had done it. He had meticulously accounted for every phantom acre, every misclassified grain, every farthing of overpayment, based on the ghostly murmurs of the receipts and the spectral laments of Thaddeus Blight. The total, a sum that Eliphalet had already committed to memory, represented a truly egregious overtaxation, a sum that in 1679 would have utterly crippled a man of modest means. He looked up at the translucent form of Thaddeus Blight, who had remained silent throughout Eliphalet's diligent calculations, hovering with an almost palpable sense of expectation. "Master Blight," Eliphalet declared, his voice a little hoarse from the long night, "the figures are clear. Based upon the original deed of your 10 acres in 1665 and the accepted descriptions of domestic versus imported barley of the period, you were indeed subject to a substantial overassessment. By my calculations, factoring in both the erroneous land valuation and the misclassified produce, you were overtaxed by a sum equivalent to... He paused, consulting his neatly written summary. 2 shillings... 4pence, and 3 farthings annually for 5 years, compounded by the subsequent penalties for non-payment. He leaned back, a professional satisfaction blooming in his chest. A truly significant sum, sir, for a man of your profession and means. Thaddeus Blight's ethereal form seemed to tremble, not with anger, but with a profound, almost heartbreaking relief. The persistent, low moan that had been his constant accompaniment since his arrival softened to a mere whisper of air. The numbers, he breathed, his voice a more defined. Though still spectral sound, you have found the numbers. The truth, in your ledger, not theirs. A faint, almost sorrowful light seemed to emanate from within his translucent being. But, accountant, that was merely the sum. The true torment began when I attempted to fight it. You speak of the ledger of my life remaining unbalanced, and indeed it did. But it was the audit, the phantom audit of my soul, conducted by those unyielding clerks, that sealed my fate and condemned me to this fiscal purgatory. Eliphaz nodded, his expression now one of deep professional empathy. He knew the bureaucratic labyrinth, the unyielding wall of officialdom. Tell me, Master Blight, he urged, taking up a fresh sheet of paper, ready to document this crucial, traumatic chapter. Tell me of this audit. What precisely transpired? Thaddeus Blight's form solidified slightly, as if the very memory of the event gave him temporary substance. He seemed to shrink, perhaps in spectral recollection of his mortal stature, before the imposing figures of authority. It was in the winter of 1680, Thaddeus began, his voice laced with the bitterness of ancient frost. After a year of fruitless appeals to the local magistrate, after my letters to the parish clerk went unanswered, after I saw my children shivering, their stomachs growling from the taxes I had paid on phantoms, I received a summons. A formal summons from the commissioners of the Exchequer themselves, to appear for a special review of accounts concerning my unusual and persistent arrears. They did not call it an audit, Eliphaz, for that word implies a search for truth. They called it a review of my arrears, as if my very existence was an unpaid bill. The ghost of Thaddeus Blight drifted to the far wall of Eliphaz's office, as if projecting the scene onto the aged plaster. The meeting was held in a stark, cold chamber in a building near Westminster, all dark oak and perpetually grey light. There sat 3 commissioners, men whose faces were as unyielding as granite, their eyes as cold as coin. They sat behind a vast table, piled high with ledgers, and among them, like a viper in a nest, sat Percival Grubbins, the customs assessor, looking self-satisfied and smug, and young Cuthbert Finchley, the surveyor, pale and nervous, but steadfast in his erroneous figures. I was allowed no advocate, Thaddeus continued, his voice a chilling echo of his past desperation. No barrister, no learned man of law. Only I, a simple monster, against the might of the crown and its unbending figures. My wife, Elara, brave woman that she was, waited outside in the biting wind, clutching our youngest, fearing the worst. I brought with me the original deed to my land, granted to my grandfather, clearly stating 10 acres. I brought samples of my barley, carefully preserved, to show them it was of the common domestic sort. I had even gathered testimony from other maltsters, honest men who had bought my grain for years, swearing to its ordinary nature. I presented these with a trembling hand, yet with the desperate conviction of a man fighting for his family's survival. And what was their response? Eliphaz asked, leaning forward, his quill poised. He felt a deep professional dread. He knew how these things went. The Crown rarely admitted error. Their response, accountant Thaddeus sighed, his spectral shoulders slumping, was a masterclass in bureaucratic denial. First, the land. I presented the original deed. Commissioner Thorne, a man whose face was a study in condescension, merely waved a hand. Master Blight, he stated, his voice a dry rustle of parchment. Whilst we acknowledge the antiquity of this document, it predates the recent and most thorough land reassessment. The current, officially recorded acreage, as verified by Surveyor Finchley here, he gestured to the trembling Cuthbert, is 12.5 acres. The Crown proceeds on current verifiable data, not on archaic family grants. Thaddeus Blight's spectral hand passed through the wall, as if demonstrating his utter inability to grasp the tangible proof. I tried to explain about the faulty chain. I pointed out that a resurvey would surely prove my claim. But Commissioner Thorne merely smiled, a thin, humorless stretching of his lips. A resurvey, Master Blight, would imply a defect in the Crown's methodology. We have no record of defective equipment, and Surveyor Finchley's assessment was conducted with the utmost diligence and according to protocol. Are you suggesting, sir, that the Crown's own implements are flawed, or that its appointed officers are negligent? It was a trap, Eliphalet, a rhetorical snare designed to corner me into accusing the very authority I was appealing to. Eliphalet winced. A classic bureaucratic maneuver. Blamed the victim for daring to question the infallible system. He scratched a note, denial of instrument defect, shifting blame to claimant for questioning authority. Then came the barley, Thaddeus continued, his voice rising again, tinged with that familiar ancient frustration. I presented my samples, carefully labeled. I offered the sworn testimonies of 5 honest maltsters. Percival Grubbins, that oaf, simply scoffed. Master Blight, he said, his voice thick with the certainty of ignorance, your barley, though perhaps grown domestically, exhibits the plumpness and uniform size characteristic of superior foreign varieties. My assessment was based on visual inspection, as per the royal decree. Are you suggesting, sir, that your grain, by some miraculous means, has transformed itself from common domestic stock into a product of superior quality, thus circumventing the spirit of the law? I explained my new fertilizing technique. I spoke of the unexpected sunshine. I pleaded that it was a triumph of husbandry, not an attempt to defraud the Crown. Thaddeus Blight wailed, a sound of profound futility. But Grubbin simply shook his head, his jowls quivering with self-importance. The Crown is concerned with appearances, Master Blight. If it looks like superior foreign barley, and performs like superior foreign barley in a visual assessment, then it is taxed as superior foreign barley. We cannot allow individual farmers to claim unique agricultural miracles as a means to avoid due tariffs. And the witnesses, the other maltsters? Eliphalet pressed, deeply disturbed by the systematic dismissal of evidence. Dismissed, Eliphalet. Dismissed outright. Thaddeus moaned. Commissioner Thorne interrupted them, saying, We are concerned here with the official assessment, not with anecdotal opinions of commercial associates. The Crown relies on the professional judgment of its appointed assessors. He spoke as if my friends were conspiring criminals, not honest tradesmen. It was then I realized the terrible truth. They were not interested in the truth of my barley, or the truth of my land. They were interested only in the truth of their own ledgers, and those ledgers, once signed and stamped, were absolute, immutable, and above all, infallible. The atmosphere in Eliphalet's office grew heavy, thick with the lingering despair of that long-ago audit. The whispers from the surrounding ledgers intensified, a soft, sorrowful chorus of numbers and names, each a testament to some forgotten error or unresolved grievance. Infallible, one whispered. Signed, sealed, doomed. another added. I felt it then, Thaddeus continued, his voice a chilling echo, the true weight of the taxman's curse. It was not merely the loss of coin, Eliphalet, though that was devastating enough. It was the loss of my dignity, the invalidation of my reality. To have my honest labor, my diligent husbandry, my very property, dismissed as a lie, a deception, by men who cared only for the ink on their page. They levied further fines for obstinacy and frivolous appeals. They demanded immediate payment of the arrears, swollen by their own penalties. They threatened seizure of my remaining assets, even my humble cottage. I was trapped, caught in a web of bureaucratic logic that defied all reason and reality. Thaddeus Blight's form pulsed with a deep internal sorrow. I returned home, a broken man. Elara wept. My children, bless their innocent hearts, knew only that their father could no longer provide for them, that the crown had taken everything. I fought for months more, selling the last of our family heirlooms, borrowing from distant cousins, but it was useless. The official verdict was final. Thaddeus Blight was a tax cheat, a man who dared to challenge the crown's infallible figures. I died just a year later, Eliphalet, not from illness, but from the slow, insidious poison of despair. My heart simply gave out, crushed under the weight of those 2.5 phantom acres and that batch of superior foreign barley. The ghost floated before Eliphalet, his form radiating an infinite bureaucratic agony. And so, my curse was sealed. I am bound to this realm, a spectral tax liability, unable to find rest. Every new tax, every complaint about levies, every debate in Parliament about revenue only serves to amplify my torment. For I see the errors, Eliphalet. I see how the system, built on the illusion of infallibility, perpetuates the very injustices it claims to prevent. My soul cannot pass on while the ledger of my life remains unbalanced, while the Crown's records falsely accuse me of debt. I am a ghost, not of a murder victim, but of a bureaucratic victim, an eternal lament against the unfairness of arbitrary figures. Eliphalet Finch sat in silence for a long moment, the scratch of his quill the only sound. His mind, usually so precise and ordered, felt a peculiar mix of horror and profound sympathy. He had always believed in the absolute truth of numbers, the comforting certainty of a perfectly balanced ledger. But Thaddeus Blight's tale painted a chilling picture. Numbers, when wielded by the incompetent or the indifferent, could become instruments of profound cruelty, capable of ruining lives and, it seemed, even trapping souls beyond the grave. The concept of a ghost haunted by tax arrears, a specter unable to cross over due to an outstanding balance, was a dark humor that only a truly dedicated accountant could appreciate. It was absurd, it was tragic, and it was, to Eliphalet, a problem that cried out for resolution. Master Blight, Eliphalet said finally, his voice low and firm, I understand now the depth of your predicament. It is not merely a matter of figures, but of fundamental justice. The Crown's infallibility, when confronted with a faulty chain and a dull-witted assessor, becomes a grave injustice. Your account, as I see it, is not merely unbalanced, but grievously misaligned. And a misaligned account, sir, is an affront to all that is proper and true. He picked up the summary of his own calculations, the precise figures of Thaddeus's overpayment. We have the evidence, he declared, holding up the paper. My calculations are meticulous. We have the previous deeds. We have the description of the barley. The challenge, Master Blight, lies in forcing the Crown, even in its spectral absence, to acknowledge its error. One cannot simply knock on the door of the afterlife's exchequer and demand a posthumous refund, alas. He paused, a flicker of something almost mischievous in his eye. But perhaps if the truth of these numbers can be made known, widely and unequivocally, then the historical record itself can be altered. Perhaps the very weight of accuracy can force a re-evaluation, even across the veil. Thaddeus Blight seemed to shimmer with a faint new energy, a spark of the determined maltster he once was. But how, accountant? How can the dead challenge the living, when the living are so stubbornly blind to their own errors? I have haunted countless clerks, whispered my grievances into the ears of sleeping assessors, but they merely shiver and attribute it to a draft. Eliphalet tapped his quill against his chin, a thoughtful, almost triumphant gleam in his eye. Ah, Master Blight, the written word possesses a unique power, and the printing press, a most marvelous invention, can disseminate truth far and wide. While the Crown's official ledgers may be unyielding in their falsehoods, there are other ledgers, other records, other forms of accounting. The public record, for instance, and the collective consciousness of those who appreciate the sanctity of numerical accuracy. We shall, if you will permit me, make your case not to the Exchequer's ghostly clerks, but to the world of the living, in a manner that cannot be dismissed as mere draft or indigestion. A profound, almost tangible silence descended upon the office, broken only by the distant crow of a rooster greeting the nascent day. The ghost of Thaddeus Blight, the maltster, seemed to hover in silent consideration of this audacious plan, a plan that involved an accountant, a printing press, and a centuries-old tax dispute. It was a strategy born of desperation, logic, and the peculiar, dry wit of an era that appreciated both meticulous figures and subtle rebellion. The trauma of the phantom audit, so vividly recounted, had laid bare the core of Thaddeus's curse. Now, Eliphalet Finch, the living, breathing embodiment of numerical rectitude, was preparing to challenge it, not with magic, but with the undeniable, irrefutable power of well-balanced books. The next phase of their spectral audit, Eliphalet knew, would require more than just calculation. It would require cunning, a deep understanding of human nature, and perhaps a willingness to stretch the boundaries of conventional accounting practice. But for a soul trapped by a ledger error, no effort was too great, no method too unorthodox. Chapter 5. The Duke's Unpaid Dues. The silence that followed Eliphalet Finch's determined declaration hung heavy in the pre-dawn air, no longer tinged with despair, but with a quiet, professional resolve. The ghost of Thaddeus Blight, the maltster, seemed to absorb Eliphalet's words, his translucent form gaining a subtle, almost internal glow. He hovered for a moment, contemplating the audacious plan of a living accountant, seeking to rectify the fiscal errors of the dead through the mundane power of the printing press. It was a strategy so peculiar, so utterly steeped in Eliphalet's world of ledgers and facts, that it held a strange, compelling logic even for a spectre. You speak of making the truth known, accountant, Thaddeus Blight finally whispered, his voice gaining a new depth, less a moan and more a resonant echo of memory. A noble aspiration, one I pursued in my life until I was crushed by the very weight of their infallibility. But know this, Eliphalet, the Crown's ledgers are not merely resistant to the truth, they are often complicit in the fabrication of lies, particularly when those lies serve the powerful. My own plight as a humble maltster was but a small, pathetic blot on their vast, corrupted balance sheet. There were greater injustices, grander deceptions, woven into the very fabric of their taxation system, ones that illustrate the true cynical heart of this eternal burden. Eliphalet, quill still in hand, nodded slowly. He had sensed this, of course. The financial world was rarely as clean and transparent as his own meticulously balanced books. He listened, prepared to document another facet of the ghost's fiscal torment. Before my malt house was seized, before despair finally claimed me, I found myself, by a twist of cruel fate, briefly entangled in the financial machinations of a truly grand deceiver. Thaddeus continued, his spectral gaze seeming to drift beyond the office walls. In his grace. Duke Alaric of Ravenswood, a man whose lands stretched from the Thames almost to the distant coast, a man whose appetites were as vast as his estates, and whose regard for the crown's coffers was as thin as a pauper's gruel. The ghost's form flickered, and the faint scent of stale wine and exotic perfumes, rather than damp earth, briefly permeated the office, as if a spectral memory of the Duke's lavish life had been conjured. The Duke was a connoisseur of extravagance, Loophole. His stables boasted horses imported from Arabia, his cellars overflowed with French claret, his wardrobes bulged with silks from Cathay. Every whim, no matter how fleeting or absurd, was indulged. Yet, despite his vast wealth, his ledgers, when presented for crown assessment, painted a picture of a man barely solvent, teetering on the brink of genteel poverty. And it was I, in my earnest numerical simplicity, who was tasked for a brief, bewildering period to assist in this grand deception. Loophole's eyebrows shot up. Thaddeus Blight, humble maltster, auditing a duke. It was an absurd image, yet it fit the peculiar, darkly humorous nature of the tale. You, Master Blight, an accountant for a duke? Not an accountant in the formal sense, no, Thaddeus clarified, a mournful chuckle escaping his lips, a sound like dry leaves skittering across a cobblestone street. My reputation as a meticulous maltster, a man who could account for every grain of barley, every drop of ale produced, had, it seemed, reached the ears of the Duke's steward, a perpetually flustered man named Master Quill. The Duke, you see, was facing a new round of benevolences and forced loans from the Crown, taxes disguised as charitable donations or temporary loans, never to be repaid. His steward, unable to creatively diminish the Duke's income enough to satisfy his Grace's miserly demands, sought out local talent. I was recommended as a man with a natural affinity for paring down figures. Little did I know, paring down meant making disappear entirely. The spectral scene shifted slightly, as if Thaddeus was reliving the moment. I arrived at Ravenswood Manor, a sprawling edifice of cold stone and even colder wealth. Master Quill presented me with the Duke's personal ledgers, immense, leather-bound tomes, filled with figures that swam before my eyes, not with complexity, but with outright fabrication. The Duke's income from his vast agricultural lands was declared as having suffered catastrophic blight for 3 consecutive years, a blight that somehow affected only his crops and none of his neighbors. His vast timber forests were supposedly ravaged by unforeseen pestilence, rendering them worthless. His fishing rights on the river, the envy of the entire county, were dismissed as yielding only a few paltry salmon for personal consumption. Thaddeus sighed, a sound filled with centuries of exasperation. My task, Loophole, was to verify these figures. Master Quill sat beside me, whispering instructions. The new stables Master Blight purchased with funds from a loan from his aged aunt, who, alas, passed away before repayment was possible. The French wines purchased as medicinal tonics for the Duke's failing health, a medical necessity. You understand. The silks for the Duchess's charitable endeavors, though what charity involved such lavish fabrics, I never did discern. Every expenditure, no matter how extravagant, was reclassified as a necessity, a misfortune, or a benevolent act, designed to reduce the Duke's taxable income to a bare minimum. Loophole's eyes widened. This was not merely evasion. This was an art form of financial deceit. And you, Master Blight, a man of such rectitude, you assisted in this? He asked, a hint of professional dismay in his voice. I was a desperate man, Loophole, Thaddeus retorted, his spectral voice resonating with ancient shame. My own lands were suffering under the burden of Finchley's and Grubbin's idiocy. I had heard whispers that the Duke in his benevolence might intercede with the commissioners if his own accounts were satisfactorily presented. I was promised a paltry sum for my consultation, enough to perhaps cover a year of my overtaxation. I saw it as a temporary corruption, a means to an end, a small detour from my usual path of numerical honesty, undertaken for the sake of my starving family. He paused, a profound, chilling sorrow settling upon him. But the crown, Eliphalet, for all its blindness to honest misfortune, possessed a keen eye for the hypocrisy of the powerful, or at least a keen nose for where true wealth lay hidden. The royal assessors, not the dullards like Grubbins, but the sharp-eyed men from London, arrived at Ravenswood Manor. This was not a routine check, but a full, intrusive audit prompted by whispers from envious neighbors and the sheer audacity of the Duke's consistently dismal financial declarations. Thaddeus Blight's form began to ripple, as if the memory of the ensuing chaos was physically unsettling him. The Duke, of course, vanished. He departed for his hunting lodge in Scotland, leaving Master Quill and myself to face the music. The royal assessors were not easily fooled. They saw the blighted crops miraculously thriving in the fields. They questioned the provenance of the medicinal tonics that seemed to fuel the Duke's boisterous late-night parties. They found the receipts for the charitable silks in the Duchess's personal accounts, rather than in any philanthropic ledger. Master Quill, bless his terrified soul, was a quivering mess, unable to defend the fabrications he had so earnestly directed me to verify. And I, the humble maltster, who had merely consulted on the accuracy of his figures, found myself cornered. They demanded to know who had prepared these falsified accounts. Master Quill, hoping to deflect blame, pointed directly to me. "This man, Master Blight, he has a genius for numbers," he advised, "on all the entries." Eliphalet gasped, a wave of familiar horror washing over him. The blame, as always, flowed downwards. The royal assessors, stern men with eyes that seemed to pierce through vellum and bone, turned their gaze upon me. Thaddeus continued, his voice heavy with ancient dread. They saw my ink-stained fingers, my precise handwriting, my earnest, desperate explanations of the Duke's unfortunate circumstances. They did not see the desperate father trying to feed his family. They saw a willing accomplice, a man of humble origins who had dared to tamper with the crown's sacred figures on behalf of a notoriously evasive Duke. They did not care that the Duke was the orchestrator. They cared only that the ye-numbersies were wrong, and I had touched them. They threatened me with imprisonment, Eliphalet, with the stocks, with public humiliation. They declared that my participation in the Duke's scheme to defraud the crown was a far greater crime than my own supposed tax arrears. My name, they said, would be associated forever with deceit and numerical corruption. The sum of the Duke's unpaid dues, which ran into hundreds of pounds, was added to my existing, unjust burden, a symbolic debt, a branding of my soul as a fiscal criminal. The spectral form of Thaddeus Blight trembled with renewed indignation, not merely for himself, but for the profound injustice of it all. The Duke, of course, paid his substantial arrears, along with a hefty fine, with a casual wave of his hand from Scotland. He returned months later, unruffled, his reputation intact, his wine cellar still brimming. But for me, the brief, desperate detour into aristocratic accounting sealed my doom. When my malt house was finally seized, the agents of the crown spoke not only of my phantom acres and superior foreign barley, but also of my complicity in the Duke's notorious tax evasion. I was branded, Eliphalet, with a double mark of shame. A man who could not manage his own simple accounts, and a man who conspired in grander deceptions. It was then I truly understood the taxman's curse in its full, hideous glory. Thaddeus whispered, the chill in the room deepening. It is not merely the numbers themselves, but the arbitrary power they grant. The crown can choose to be blind to the vast, deliberate evasions of the wealthy, and yet apply merciless scrutiny to the slightest, most innocent error of a common man. It can demand payment for lands that do not exist and products that were never imported. And when it finds a scapegoat, it condemns them, not just in coin but in spirit, forever branding their name with a lie. Elifalet Finch sat utterly still, his quill forgotten. The morning light had now fully pierced the window, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air, the aged paper of his ledgers, and the shimmering, sorrowful form of Thaddeus Blight. This new revelation added a profound layer of cynical despair to the ghost's torment. It wasn't just a bureaucratic error. It was a systemic injustice, a rigged game, where the rules applied differently based on one station. Thaddeus wasn't just a victim of incompetence. He was a victim of convenience, blamed for a duke's greed, his integrity irrevocably stained by proximity to power and its abuses. "So, your final burden, Master Blight," Elifalet said slowly, his voice laced with a newfound gravity, "was not merely the 2.5 phantom acres, nor the misclassified barley, but also the phantom debt of a duke's calculated evasion, falsely attributed to your complicity." "Precisely." "Accountant," Thaddeus wailed, a sound that finally held a touch of something akin to rage. "My very soul, when I passed, was weighed down by a fictional debt that was never mine, a debt that served to cover the duke's cunning and the crown's selective blindness. I am not merely a ghost of an overtaxed maltster. I am a ghost of a scapegoat, an eternal lament against the moral bankruptcy of a system that judges by convenience, not by truth." Elifalet closed his eyes for a moment, absorbing the full, bitter irony of the situation. Thaddeus Blight, the ghost that only moaned about taxes, was a testament not just to bureaucratic blunders, but to the inherent inequities of a class-based society and the cynical manipulation of its fiscal laws. His audit, Elifalet realized, was not just about rectifying numbers. It was about reclaiming a soul's tarnished reputation, about proving the innocence of a man crushed by a system designed to protect itself, not its citizens. The printing press, he mused, would have to work overtime to print a truth so complex, so layered with historical injustice. But for Thaddeus Blight and for the purity of the ledger, it would be a task well worth undertaking. He would not just balance accounts, he would expose a historical lie, one ink-stained figure at a time. The world, and perhaps even the spectral realm, needed to know the true burden of the Duke's unpaid dues, and how they had ultimately, indirectly, claimed the spirit of a simple maltster. Chapter 6. The moaning midnight, meeting the persistent, almost surgical clarity of Elifalet Finch's accounting had for a time brought a measure of peace to the restless spirit of Thaddeus Blight. The painstaking documentation of his 2.5 phantom acres, the meticulous reclassification of his barley, and the damning expose of the Duke's evaded duties had provided the spectral maltster with something akin to validation. Yet, the Crown, in its infinite, unyielding bureaucracy, remained unmoved by the meticulous notes of a 17th-century accountant, however well-reasoned. The cosmic ledger, it seemed, was not so easily balanced, and thus Thaddeus Blight's torment, while briefly assuaged, was not truly lifted. Time, for a ghost, flowed differently, and the centuries blurred into a continuum of fiscal grievance, allowing his particular brand of suffering to transcend eras, seeking out the scent of late-night accounting and the quiet despair of those who wrestled with the Crown's figures. It was in the hushed, almost sterile glow of a modern London tax consultancy office, some 350 years after Thaddeus Blight's earthly demise, that his spectral presence next made itself known. The year was now 2023, and the air, instead of parchment and lamp oil, hummed with the faint thrum of computers, the scent of stale coffee, and the pervasive, almost electric, tang of fluorescent lights. Miss Eleanor Vance, a woman whose spectacles were perpetually smudged, and whose hair possessed a permanent artful disarray, hunched over a glowing screen. Her fingers, stained not with ink, but with the phantom residue of countless keyboard strokes, danced across the keys, inputting figures for a particularly complex multinational corporate tax return. The hour was well past midnight. The only sounds the rhythmic click of her mouse, the distant drone of the city, and the slow, steady drip of the coffee machine in the kitchenette. Eleanor found a perverse comfort in the late hours. The world outside slept, leaving her alone with the comforting, if sometimes maddening, certainty of numbers. She prided herself on her meticulousness, her ability to unearth a misplaced decimal point or a dubious deduction with the tenacity of a bloodhound. She was Eliphalet Finch's spiritual successor, though she knew it not. Eleanor sighed, rubbing her tired eyes. A particularly thorny issue regarding the allocation of research and development credits in a subsidiary based in a low-tax jurisdiction was proving recalcitrant. The figures just wouldn't align, not without stretching the boundaries of what she considered ethically permissible. And Eleanor, like her distant predecessor, held a quiet, almost sacred devotion to numerical rectitude. She shifted in her ergonomic chair, the faux leather creaking softly, and reached for her mug, only to find it empty. A minor irritation, but enough to break her concentration. She pushed away from her desk, planning a brief pilgrimage to the coffee machine. It was then that she heard it. A sound, low and mournful, that seemed to emanate from the vicinity of the towering server racks where the firm's vast digital ledgers resided. It was not the hum of the servers, nor the creak of the old building. It was a lament, a prolonged, sorrowful exhalation that was undeniably, unnervingly human in its despair. Taxes, it wailed, a sound imbued with centuries of bureaucratic frustration. The digital levies, the intangible assets. It's all so unphysical. Eleanor froze mid-stretch, her hand hovering in the air. She blinked, once, twice, adjusting her spectacles. "Hello?" she called out, her voice a reedy whisper in the cavernous office. "Is anyone there?" "Mark." "Sarah?" No answer, of course. She was the last one in the office, as usual. She told herself it was the wind, or perhaps the pipes, though the building was relatively new, and pipes rarely moaned with such profound fiscal sorrow. Her imagination, she decided, was running riot after too much caffeine and too many obscure tax codes. Then, from the glowing blue light of the server racks, a shimmering, translucent form began to coalesce. It was vague at first, a shifting, smoky outline, but then it gained a distinct, if spectral definition. A man dressed in what appeared to be utterly outdated 17th-century attire. His edges were soft, wavering like heat haze, and seemed to float an inch or two above the polished linoleum floor. His face, when it resolved, was etched with an infinite weariness, a perpetual frown of administrative grievance. His eyes, twin pools of spectral gray, were fixed not on Eleanor, but on the blinking lights of the server rack, as if contemplating the vast digital ledger contained within. "The very air is taxed, I tell you," the ghost moaned, a sound that seemed to vibrate through the floor. "And now, the very yeathery. The cloud, they call it. A cloud of fiscal damnation. They tax the very thoughts, the very data, that flits through the unseen wires. Where is the physical product? Where's the tangible asset to assess? It's all I vapor." Eleanor Vance, a woman who prided herself on her unflappable composure in the face of demanding clients and incomprehensible tax legislation, felt a distinct flutter in her chest. She had heard of ghosts, of course, but always in hushed whispers or sensational online articles. Never had one intruded upon her carefully ordered, logically sound world of corporate finance. And this one, this particular specter, was complaining about cloud computing and intangible asset taxation. It was, she had to admit, a remarkably specific and utterly boring haunting. "Excuse me," Eleanor managed, her voice a little shaky. Are you quite all right? Are you perhaps lost?" "This is the finance department." She instinctively reached for her phone, then remembered it was on silent and probably wouldn't help against a spectral entity. The ghost slowly turned his weary gaze towards her, his form shimmering. "Lost? I? Lost to the ages, lost to fiscal justice. My name in life was Thaddeus Blight, a maltster, and I am here to warn you, accountant, against the insidious nature of the Crown's insatiable appetite. It begins with the window tax, then the hearth tax, and before you know it, they are taxing the very light of day. And now this internet, a vast unseen web of tax obligations. Mark my words, woman, they'll find a way to levy a duty on every keystroke." Eleanor stared, her professional mind grappling with the absurdity. A 17th century ghost worried about keystroke taxes. "Master Blight," she began, attempting to sound calm and rational, as one would with a slightly unhinged client, "I assure you, there is no keystroke tax in the current fiscal year, and the window tax was abolished centuries ago." "Abolished?" Thaddeus Blight's mournful voice rose in pitch. "Lays. They merely recategorize it. They called it property betterment levies or infrastructure contributions. It's all the same, accountant. A new name for the same old larceny. My torment began with a faulty surveying chain and a customs assessor named Percival Grubbins, who could not tell common barley from superior foreign. The very ground beneath my feet was over-assessed, and now you deal with digital land and virtual currencies. It's the same deception, merely cloaked in new, bewildering terminology." He drifted closer to Eleanor's desk, his translucent form passing through a stack of modern tax forms, his spectral gaze fixed on her glowing computer screen, where the complex multinational figures swam. "Look at this," he moaned, his voice echoing with profound ancient despair. "All these tiny figures, flashing and changing. Where is the solid ledger? Where is the firm ink? How can one argue against a tax when the very numbers exist only as fleeting light on a screen? It's a conspiracy, I tell you, designed to obscure the truth. To prevent proper auditing." Eleanor, despite her initial shock, found a strange, exasperated amusement rising within her. The ghost was genuinely distressed by the immateriality of modern finance. "Master Blight," she said, trying to inject a soothing tone into her voice, "these are digital ledgers. They are far more efficient and accurate than paper, and the numbers are very much real, even if they don't have a physical form. This particular problem I'm facing involves research and development credits." "Research and development," Thaddeus Blight interrupted, his voice laced with the bitterness of a man whose agricultural innovation was deemed superior foreign and taxed into ruin. "Ah, yes, the advancement of industry. A fine-sounding phrase, often used to justify some new imposition. In my time, they levied a duty on improved agricultural techniques, forcing farmers to pay for their own ingenuity. Do not be fooled, accountant. These credits are merely another layer of obfuscation. They give with one hand and take with five." He gestured vaguely at her screen, his spectral hand passing through the monitor. "You must seek the original grant, the foundational deed, the first principle. Is this research truly new? Or is it merely the repackaging of old knowledge, disguised as innovation to justify a new tax break for the powerful? And these subsidiaries, more layers of deceit? In my day, it was dukes claiming false blights on their crops, scattering their wealth among distant manors to avoid their dues. Now they scatter it across the very globe into these low-tax jurisdictions. Eleanor felt a jolt of recognition. The Duke's unpaid dues. A corporation with subsidiaries in tax havens. The parallels, though separated by centuries and technological leaps, were chillingly similar in their underlying principle of evasion. The ghost, for all his outdated understanding, had a point about the fundamental nature of tax avoidance. "You're saying that these complex structures even today are essentially the same as the Duke of Ravenswood's methods of tax evasion?" she asked, a newfound curiosity overcoming her fear. Thaddeus Blight's form solidified slightly, a look of profound eternal weariness on his face. "Aye, accountant. The more complex the system, the more opportunity for the powerful to hide their true wealth, whilst the common man shoulders the burden. My 2.5 phantom acres, my superior foreign barley, they were but a single insignificant ripple in a vast ocean of such deception." The Duke simply paid his fine and continued his lavish existence, whilst I was condemned by a ledger entry. And I see it now, through your glowing portal, the same patterns, the same lies, cloaked in a new century's finery. He moaned, a low, drawn-out sound of utter futility. They claim globalization and digital commerce, but it's still the same old shell game, moving the coin from one pocket to another, whilst the crown, ever ravenous, demands its pound of flesh from those who cannot hide their modest gains. Be wary, accountant. Be wary of these credits and loopholes, for they are often merely traps, designed to snare the unwary, whilst the truly cunning sail through unimpeded. Eleanor found herself nodding, a strange sense of camaraderie forming with the spectral maltster. He was, in his own profoundly anachronistic way, articulating a frustration she often felt with the modern tax system. Its complexity, its inherent biases towards the wealthy, and its tendency to penalize the small while, enabling the grand evasion. "So, your advice is to look for the simplest truth?" She mused, half to herself, half to the ghost. To ignore the layers of complexity and find the core asset, the core income, and see if it's genuinely fairly taxed. The truth, accountant. The truth, in the tangible, not in the vapor, not in the cloud. Thaddeus Blight wailed, growing agitated again. "And beware the faulty chain, the faulty algorithm. For a single misplaced digit, a single error in your code can doom a soul just as surely as Cuthbert Finchley's blundering survey." His ghostly hand waved towards her computer screen, as if swatting away invisible fiscal flies. Eleanor stared at her screen, then back at the shimmering, moaning ghost of Thaddeus Blight. He was absurd, unhelpful in any practical sense for her modern predicament. Yet his ancient grievances resonated with an uncomfortable truth about the enduring nature of taxation and its injustices. She thought of the research and development credits and the seemingly innocuous subsidiary that allowed for the allocation. Was it genuinely innovative research or merely a clever repackaging of existing knowledge for a tax benefit, just as the Duke's expenses were repackaged? The ghost had, inadvertently, given her a new lens through which to view her current problem. A cynical, 17th century perspective on corporate tax planning. The audit might be phantom, but the grievances and the underlying truths were stubbornly real, spanning centuries. Eleanor Vance, the modern tax consultant, found herself contemplating the profound, boring wisdom of a ghost who only moaned about taxes. The night was still young, and the complexities of her digital ledgers suddenly felt far more ancient than she had ever imagined. Chapter 7. The cursed Quill. Eleanor Vance stood transfixed in the hushed, blue-lit glow of the server room, the chill from the humming machinery doing little to mitigate the peculiar warmth spreading through her, a warmth born of a strange, profound understanding. Thaddeus Blight, the spectral maltster, hovered before her, his lamentations about the Duke's unpaid dues, and the insidious nature of modern digital taxation resonating with an unsettling, timeless truth. His anger, once diffuse, now sharpened into a laser focus on the systemic injustices of finance, past and present. Eleanor, a woman who prided herself on logic and data, found herself confronting the ethereal embodiment of both. The ghost, for all his anachronistic complaints, was articulating a frustration that often simmered beneath the surface of her own professional life. The pervasive sense that the rules, however complex, were always bent in favor of the powerful. "You speak of the Duke's cunning, Master Blight," Eleanor finally said, her voice softer now, tinged with a new empathy. "And the Crown's selective blindness. It seems the essence of tax avoidance, for all our technological advancements, remains remarkably consistent. The digital cloud and low-tax jurisdictions are merely the modern equivalent of His Grace's blighted crops and medicinal tonics." Thaddeus Blight's translucent form rippled, a faint, almost relieved sigh escaping his spectral lips. "Aye, accountant. The names change, the technology evolves, but the underlying mechanisms of evasion and the burden on the honest man remain eternal. But there is a deeper layer to my torment, a more insidious brand of suffering that arose from my brief, desperate service to His Grace, the Duke of Ravenswood. It was not merely the numbers themselves, nor the public branding of my name, but the very instrument by which those lies were recorded that compounded my curse." The ghost drifted slowly towards Eleanor's desk, his spectral gaze fixed not on the glowing screen, but on a collection of neatly arranged pens and pencils in a ceramic holder. A faint tremor ran through his form, a shudder that seemed to pull at the very fabric of his ethereal being. "You use these modern devices," he whispered, his voice gaining a new, chilling resonance, "these keyboards and mice, to etch your figures into the unseen ether. But I was forced to use a quill. Not merely Jenny Quill, mind you, but shiz Quill. A quill, il fallait, that felt as if it had been fashioned from the very bones of forgotten taxpayers, dipped in the ink of their silent tears." Eleanor looked at her own assortment of writing implements, then back at the shimmering ghost. A cursed quill. It was a touch more fantastical than the previous revelations, yet, given the context, a disturbingly apt metaphor. "A specific quill, Master Blight?" she inquired, trying to keep her tone even. "Indeed," Thaddeus replied, his voice heavy with ancient dread. "It was Master Quill, the Duke's steward, who presented it to me on my first day at Ravenswood Manor. A forced day of service, mind you." "Master Blight," he had chirped, his flustered eyes darting about as if constantly expecting the Crown's assessors to burst through the door. "His Grace insists upon using his own personal writing instruments for matters of utmost discretion. This quill, freshly trimmed, from a peregrine falcon's wing no less, would be your tool in these vital accounts. It was a grand, ornate thing fashioned with a silver ferrule far too fine for my ink-stained hands." The ghost's form flickered, and the faint scent of something metallic and cold, like old blood or tarnished silver, briefly overlaid the familiar office aromas. "The moment I grasped it," Thaddeus continued, a low moan escaping him, "I felt a chilling cold emanate from its shaft, seeping into my very bones. It was not the cold of the drafty manner, but a profound, unnatural chill that seemed to whisper of deceit and moral compromise. And when I dipped it into the Duke's inkwell, a rich, dark fluid that seemed to absorb all light, the very ink felt thick, sluggish for honest numbers, yet flowed with a dreadful eagerness for every fabrication." He drifted closer to Eleanor's desk, his spectral finger pointing at an imaginary page, recounting the agonizing process. "I would begin with a true entry, a genuine expenditure, and the quill would drag, the ink would barely adhere to the parchment, as if fighting my very hand. My neat, precise hand, Loophole, trained over decades in the sanctity of truthful figures. But then Master Quill would lean over, whispering, "Master Blight, remember the Duke's unforeseen expenditures on emergency stable renovations due to an outbreak of phantom equine distemper. A significant sum, if you please. And mark it under unforeseen animal husbandry. It was the Duke's favored tax dodge for lavish parties, you see." Thaddeus Blight shuddered, his translucent shoulders slumping. And at that instruction, the quill would change. It would feel lighter, almost buoyant in my grip. The ink would flow, swift and dark, tracing the fraudulent numbers with a terrible ease. It was as if the quill itself was an accomplice, an instrument of the Duke's deception, eager to set down the lies, to weave the intricate web of fiscal falsehoods. I would write, against my very conscience, that the sum for emergency stable renovations was equivalent to the cost of a small village, for a disease that existed only in the Duke's imagination and Master Quill's ledger. Eleanor imagined the scene, a grim tableau of a desperate, honest man, forced to wield a tool of deceit. The quill, not literally possessed, but psychologically charged by the weight of the lies it recorded. It was a mundane object made horrifying by its purpose. And the specific transactions? Eleanor prompted, her professional curiosity once again piqued. What sort of deceptions did this cursed quill facilitate? Oh, the variety was endless, accountant, and the absurdity profound. Thaddeus wailed, his spectral voice gaining a cadence of bitter, ancient amusement. There were expenditures on defensive fortifications against mythical forest trolls to account for the Duke's new hunting lodge. There were losses due to inexplicable spontaneous combustion of the winter harvest, which covered the sale of perfectly good grain at inflated prices to his own cronies. There was the infamous loan from the spirit of the late great Aunt Agatha, a woman who had died penniless and childless 50 years prior, used to justify the purchase of a new diamond necklace for the Duchess. He paused, a low, sorrowful moan escaping him. Each false entry, each meticulously crafted lie, laid down by my own hand, yet compelled by the strange, unnatural lightness of that cursed quill, felt like a stain upon my soul. The ink, once dried, seemed to burn into the parchment, a mark not just of numbers, but of moral compromise. I would try to resist, to slow my hand, to make a true entry, and the quill would grow heavy cold, almost fighting against my will. But when the lie was formed in my mind, when the deception was clear, it would glide across the vellum, almost writing itself, eager to record the falsehood. Thaddeus gestured to Eleanor's keyboard. "It is the same, I tell you, with your glowing screens and your clicking keys. When you are forced to reclassify a genuine expenditure as a research and development credit for a shadowy subsidiary in a distant land, do your fingers not feel a strange, ethereal lightness? Does the very act of typing that carefully worded, yet ultimately misleading, description not flow with an insidious ease? Do you not feel the subtle shift in the truth, bending to the will of the numbers rather than the numbers reflecting the honest truth?" Eleanor looked down at her own fingers, resting on the keyboard. She thought of the hours she spent trying to find the most advantageous classification for clients' expenses, of the carefully worded justifications for deductions that stretched the boundaries of interpretation. She recalled the faint, almost imperceptible sense of unease that sometimes accompanied such work, a quiet voice in her mind wondering if she was not merely optimizing, but in some subtle way fabricating. The ghost's words, absurdly ancient, suddenly struck a chilling modern chord. The cursed quill was not a magical item. It was the psychological burden of a tool used to record untruths, a burden that manifested as a physical sensation. "Every time I dipped that cursed quill into the inkwell," Thaddeus continued, his voice laced with the weariness of ages, "it felt as though I was dipping my very soul into the murky waters of deceit. And when I finally signed my name beneath the Duke's fabricated accounts, It was not merely a signature of verification, but a mark of my own complicity, a seal upon my own condemnation. My integrity, il fallait, was not merely tarnished by the Duke's schemes, it was actively corrupted by the very instrument I was forced to wield in his service. That Quill, more than any decree or faulty chain, etched the bitter taste of fiscal dishonesty into my very being. A deep, sorrowful moan filled the modern office, a sound that seemed to carry the weight of centuries of financial lies. When I finally succumbed to despair, Thaddeus lamented, and my spirit departed my body. I carried with me the indelible mark of that Quill. It was as if my ghostly form was still holding it, still compelled to record the endless shifting fabrications of the powerful. My soul, in this purgatory, is eternally attempting to rewrite those fraudulent entries, to scratch out the lies, to erase the phantom sums, but the ink is permanent, the parchment unyielding, and the Quill, oh, the cursed Quill, continues to write its invisible falsehoods upon the very fabric of my spectral existence. He gestured around the modern office towards the glowing screens and the silent keyboards. You see it now, do you not, accountant? The tools change, from quill to keyboard, from parchment to pixel, but the fundamental curse remains. The pressure to bend the numbers, to stretch the truth, to turn a blind eye to the reality of wealth and its evasions. Every time you enter a figure that you know, in your heart, is merely a sophisticated fabrication designed to circumvent the crown's due. You are wielding a cursed quill, dipping it into the ink of compromise, and staining your own ledger with the insidious truth of selective accountability. Eleanor sat down slowly, her fingers now feeling oddly heavy on the cool plastic of her keyboard. The ghost's words, born of a long-past era of physical ledgers and feathered pens, resonated with an unnerving clarity in her high-tech digital world. The R&D credit she was wrestling with, the complex structure designed to minimize the multinational's tax burden, was it truly innovative? Or was it merely a sophisticated phantom equine distemper in a new guise? Was she, Eleanor Vance, wielding a modern-day cursed quill, her fingers dancing across the keys, inputting the unforeseen animal husbandry of the 21st century? She looked at Thaddeus Blight, his form still shimmering with the residual torment of his past. His haunting was not just about taxes. It was about integrity, about the soul's relentless pursuit of balance, even in the face of insurmountable bureaucratic lies. The irony was almost unbearable. A ghost, suffering from the moral stain of a physical writing instrument, attempting to warn a living accountant about the invisible ethical pitfalls of her digital tool. So, Master Blight, Eleanor mused aloud, her voice barely a whisper. The curse is not in the object itself, but in the purpose it serves. The intention behind the numbers. The willingness to record a lie, however subtly, for expediency or gain. Precisely, Thaddeus wailed, a sound that was a mix of affirmation and lingering despair. The ledger, Eliphalet, the ledger of your life, is the only one that truly matters. Do not let its pages be filled with the ink of compromise, with figures that betray the truth. For the crown may forgive its debts, but the soul's ledger demands an honest balance. The spectral monster seemed to recede slightly, his form growing more indistinct, as if the profound act of recounting this particular, painful truth had momentarily exhausted his ethereal energy. Eleanor, however, felt a surge of something akin to professional, ethical resolve. The night was still young, and the complex R&D credit awaited. But now, she would approach it differently. She would not just audit the numbers, she would audit the intention behind them, searching for the underlying truth, no matter how many layers of digital obfuscation or how many centuries of precedent stood in her way. For a ghost had reminded her that some curses, those of the ledger and the soul, transcended time, and that the honesty of the numbers was a cause worth fighting for, even in the dead of night. Chapter 8. The rebellion of the overtaxed Eleanor Vance, bathed in the cool blue glow of her computer screen, continued to ponder the peculiar wisdom imparted by the spectral maltster. The concept of the cursed Quill had struck a chord, a subtle resonance with the ethical ambiguities she navigated daily in the intricate world of modern corporate tax. Thaddeus Blight's Lamentations, though centuries old and steeped in the mundane grievances of 17th century fiscal policy, held a chilling mirror to the present. The Duke's evasions, the system's selective blindness, the burden falling upon the honest and the unassuming, it was a narrative as old as taxation itself. The air in the office, once merely stale with coffee and late-night work, now felt imbued with the ghostly essence of historical injustice, a persistent hum of numbers gone wrong. Thaddeus Blight, his translucent form still wavering near her desk, seemed to sense her absorption, her silent reckoning with his ancient truths. His mournful moan, a sound that had grown oddly comforting in its familiarity, softened, taking on a new, almost narrative quality. "You grasp the threads. Accountant," he whispered, his voice like the rustle of ancient parchment. "You see the pattern etched across the centuries. But the Crown's appetite, Eliphalet, is not merely sated by the quiet, methodical theft of a man's livelihood through faulty measures and misclassifications. It has, throughout history, provoked the desperate to act, to rise, to rebel against the relentless grind of fiscal oppression. And I, alas, found myself an unwilling player in one such foolish, yet profoundly illustrative drama. A rebellion, if you can call such a numerically illiterate endeavor by so grand a name, born of salt and windows, and a complete misunderstanding of the true power of bureaucracy." Eleanor leaned back in her chair, a curious mix of dread and fascination gripping her. A peasant revolt. She imagined rough men with pitchforks. A scene ripped from a historical drama, but undoubtedly filtered through the unique, ledger-obsessed mind of Thaddeus Blight. "Tell me, Master Blight," she urged, already envisioning the meticulous notes she would take, even if only in her mind, of this spectral recounting. It was in the bleak winter of 1680, shortly after my infamous audit by the commissioners and the branding of my name with the Duke's fictitious debts, Thaddeus began, his spectral form seeming to dim slightly, as if recalling the pervasive chill of that year. "My family, as you know, was barely clinging to existence. The malt house seized, the fields forfeit, my wife, Ilara, reduced to mending the children's threadbare garments by the light of a single, hoarded tallow candle. The spirit was gone from our lives, replaced by the gnawing cold of poverty and the bitter taste of injustice. But we were not alone in our suffering. Throughout our village, indeed, throughout much of Kent, the mood was sour, fermenting like a batch of poorly tended wort. The Crown, having just replenished its coffers after some foreign skirmish or another, decided that the common folk had yet more to give. He drifted towards the ghostly image of a window in the office, his translucent hand passing through the glass. They reintroduced the hearth tax with a new, even more stringent enforcement. Every fireplace, every chimney, taxed without mercy, whether it warmed a grand hall or a humble cottage. And the window tax, that pernicious levy on light itself. My neighbor, Thomas, a cooper by trade, was forced to brick up half his windows, plunging his home into perpetual gloom, simply to avoid the Crown's charge for the air that entered his dwelling. The very light of heaven, taxed. And then, the salt tax. Not merely on imported salt, mind you, but on every grain, even that extracted from the local salt pans. How could a common family preserve their meager stores of meat or fish, Eliphalet, when the very salt to cure it was priced beyond their reach? It was a tax on survival itself. Thaddeus Blight's mournful voice echoed with the collective grievances of centuries of common folk. The villagers, simple farming folk, honest laborers, and a few artisans were at their breaking point. Their complaints, once whispered in alehouses, began to grow louder, fueled by desperation and cheap cider. They spoke of the king's neglect, of the distant commissioners who saw them only as numbers on a page, as sources of endless revenue. One evening, in the muddy yard of the Drunken Plowman Inn, a particularly fiery orator, a self-proclaimed prophet named Ezekiel, whose beard was as wild as his pronouncements, stirred the pot of discontent into a simmering rage. He declared that God himself abhorred such unjust taxes, that the crown's coffers were filled with the tears of the innocent, and that only direct action could loosen the grip of the exchequer. Eleanor imagined the scene, a grimly comic tableau, a prophet with a wild beard, rousing numerically illiterate peasants to rebel against the sophisticated, if unfair, machinery of state finance. "And how did you become involved, Master Blight?" she asked, anticipating the twist of unfortunate circumstance. Alas, my own suffering had made me a familiar, if spectral, figure of woe in the village. Thaddeus sighed, his form momentarily flickering with self-pity. I was known as Old Thaddeus, the one the taxman ruined. My emaciated frame, my perpetually worried expression, my habit of muttering about phantom acres and misclassified barley to anyone who would listen, all made me a walking, breathing testament to the crown's fiscal cruelty. When Ezekiel called for a meeting, a gathering of the grievously oppressed, I attended, not out of any revolutionary fervor, but out of a desperate professional curiosity. I wanted to understand the numbers of their discontent, to see if their collective grievances, unlike my own individual ones, held any true statistical weight. I brought with me a small, tattered scroll, on which I had meticulously detailed my own personal overtaxation, hoping perhaps to find common cause, a shared mathematical error. He paused, a faint, ghostly flush seeming to rise in his translucent cheeks. That was my first mistake. Il fallait punct. My second was standing too close to the front of the agitated crowd. And my third, and most damning, was holding up my scroll of figures. Ezekiel, in his zeal, mistook my detailed accounts for a manifesto of injustice, and my quiet, analytical mutterings for the wisdom of a persecuted scholar. Before I knew it, I was hoisted onto the shoulders of two burly farmers, their hands reeking of manure and desperation. Old Thaddeus knows the truth, Ezekiel bellowed, pointing at me with a gnarled finger. He has the figures. He has calculated their wickedness. Let him lead us to justice. Thaddeus Blight groaned, a sound of profound embarrassment that transcended the grave. Me! Lead them. I, a man whose greatest martial skill lay in balancing a precarious stack of ledgers, who possessed a profound distaste for anything that defied numerical order. I was horrified. I tried to protest, to explain that my scroll was merely a personal accounting, a detailed exposition of my own particular fiscal woes, not a blueprint for armed insurrection. "Friends," I cried, my voice reedy against the roar of the crowd, "the problem's not merely the big existence of the tax, but the rhyme application of its coefficients. We must approach this with a rigorous audit of the royal decrees, not with agricultural implements." He shook his spectral head, a gesture of centuries of futility. They did not listen. They heard tax and wickedness and justice and swept me along. Their arms were indeed pitchforks, scythes, rusty spades, and even a few well-aimed rotten cabbages. Their strategy was to march on the local tax collector's office, seize his ledgers, and burn the lies that were recorded within. A noble sentiment, perhaps, but a logistical nightmare, and, from an accounting perspective, utterly counterproductive. How would they prove their overpayments if the very records that documented them were reduced to ash? The ghostly scene unfolded around Eleanor, a bizarre, darkly comical march of grievances. The procession, if it could be called that, was less a disciplined army and more a meandering collection of disgruntled villagers, each shouting about their own specific fiscal burden. "Down with the window tax," cried a woman clutching a baby. "No more hearth tax," boomed a blacksmith, waving a flaming torch that singed the beard of the man beside him. "Our barley is domestic." I heard myself wail, almost instinctively, for my own specific torment was still fresh. But my plea was lost in the general cacophony of discontent. It was a rebellion of the numerically aggrieved, but utterly lacking in numerical coherence. Thaddeus Blight sighed, a sound of profound disappointment. We reached the humble, timber-framed office of Master Gregory Finch, the local tax collector, a man as meek and terrified as I was. He was already cowering beneath his desk, his hand clutching his ledger as if it were a shield. The crowd, emboldened by their own numbers and the scent of perceived victory, burst through the door. They demanded the ledgers, shrieking about crown larceny and official corruption. And what did Master Finch do? Eleanor prompted, imagining the terrified clerk. He wept, Eliphalet. He literally wept onto his meticulously kept pages. Thaddeus exclaimed, his spectral voice filled with a peculiar blend of pity and exasperation. "Please, good sirs and madams," he wailed, clutching his books to his chest. "These are the king's records. They are not my doing. I merely transcribe. It is Parliament that levies. It is the exchequer that demands." He was, in his own way, as much a victim of the system's unyielding nature as we were, merely a cog in the grand machine of fiscal extraction. But the mob did not care for nuance. They wanted a tangible target for their fury, and his ledgers filled with the hated numbers. Verit. Thaddeus Blight's form stiffened, and the office seemed to grow colder, a chilling echo of the inevitable conclusion. Just as a farmer, wielding a rusty scythe, prepared to strike down the poor man's desk and seize his books. The Crown's response arrived, not with a grand cavalry charge, but with a sudden, efficient, and profoundly unromantic display of force. A contingent of the local militia, commanded by a Captain Blackwood, a man known for his rigid adherence to protocol and his even more rigid posture, appeared as if from the very air. They were not many, perhaps a dozen men, but they were armed with muskets and pikes, and more importantly, with the unshakable authority of the Crown. They did not speak, Eliphalet, Thaddeus explained, his voice hushed. They simply formed a line, presented their muskets, and Captain Blackwood, without raising his voice, merely stated, "Disperse, ye malcontents," or face the full and unforgiving might of the king's law concerning sedition and the obstruction of revenue collection. The peasants, for all their bluster and their pitchforks, understood the cold, undeniable logic of a loaded musket. The rebellion, born of fiscal despair, died with a whimper, not a bang. The crowd melted away, grumbling, scattering like frightened chickens, their revolutionary ardor evaporating faster than a poorly kept ledger entry in a damp cellar. Thaddeus Blight hovered, his form tinged with the lingering shame and futility of the event. I, still inexplicably perched on the farmer's shoulders, found myself suddenly dropped into the mud as they fled. Captain Blackwood, a man whose gaze was as sharp as a newly honed quill, fixed his eyes upon me, my scroll of figures still clutched in my hand. "Ah, Master Blight," he stated, his voice devoid of emotion, "the notorious tax evader. It seems your penchant for disputed figures now extends to inciting unrest. Your name is already marked in the king's ledgers, and now your participation in this peasant accounting error, shall we say, has sealed your fate further." I tried to explain again, Eliphalet. Thaddeus wailed, a sound of desperate, eternal exasperation. I was a participant by accident, a leader by misapprehension. I tried to explain that their grievances were numerically valid, but their methods fiscally unsound, that a well-structured appeal, supported by clear, quantifiable evidence, would have yielded more fruit than a collection of rusty farm tools. But he merely nodded, his eyes cold. The Crown, Master Blight, does not negotiate with mobs. The figures, once entered, are final. Your arrears, now compounded by this treasonous foolishness, must be settled. The ghostly form slumped, radiating profound and ancient despair. And so, Eliphalet, the rebellion of the overtaxed, a brief, chaotic spasm of numerical indignation, came to nothing. It merely served to deepen my own personal fiscal damnation. My name, already stained by the Duke's deception, was now branded with the ignominy of instigator of rustic riot. I had failed to move the crown with my meticulously calculated appeals, and I had failed to move the masses with my logical, albeit numerical, arguments for better methods of protest. I was trapped between two unyielding forces, the impenetrable wall of bureaucratic infallibility and the chaotic, ineffectual rage of the common man. My death, shortly thereafter, was not just from despair, but from the crushing weight of that futility, the knowledge that neither careful calculation nor desperate rebellion could shift the unyielding hand of the taxman. Eleanor Vance shivered, despite the office's ambient warmth. The dark humor of the story was undeniable. A tax accountant forced to lead a peasant revolt, but beneath it lay a profound tragedy. Thaddeus Blight's fate was a grim testament to the enduring power of the state, its ability to bend reality to its own numbers, and the often futile struggles of those caught in its relentless gears. His curse wasn't just about unpaid taxes. It was about the crushing of individual agency, the systematic invalidation of truth in the face of bureaucratic decree. "So, Master Blight," Eleanor mused, looking at her computer screen, where the complex corporate tax figures still danced, a modern ballet of fiscal avoidance. "Your experience taught you that neither meticulous accounting nor desperate rebellion could change the crown's numbers. And now, centuries later, we are still wrestling with the same fundamental problem: how to make the powerful accountable for their numbers, and how to ensure fairness for everyone, not just those with the means to manipulate the system." Thaddeus Blight's spectral form brightened slightly, a faint, almost imperceptible nod of agreement. "Indeed, accountant. The names change, the methods evolve. From faulty chains to digital algorithms, from Duke's blighted crops to corporate research credits. But the core truth remains. The numbers can be weaponized. They can be used to oppress, to mislead, to maintain power. My purgatory is a testament to that enduring truth, and my longing for peace, Eliphalet, is a longing for the world's ledgers to be truly, honestly balanced, not merely according to the whims of the crown, but according to the immutable, unyielding truth of what is just and fair." Eleanor felt a deep, unfamiliar sense of purpose stirring within her. She was not just an accountant. She was, in her own way, a custodian of truth, a defender of numerical integrity. The night was still long, and the complex tax return awaited. But now she would approach it with a new perspective, a heightened awareness of the hidden narratives within the numbers, and the phantom grievances that might still resonate from behind the gleaming screens of the modern world. The rebellion of the overtaxed, she realized, was an eternal one, fought not with pitchforks, but with precise calculations, and, perhaps, with the quiet, persistent voice of a haunting truth. Chapter 9. The Ghost's Ledger of Lamentations. Eleanor Vance leaned back, the faint internal hum of the modern office, a stark contrast to the spectral silence that now hung in the air, broken only by the occasional distant drone of a London night bus. The ghost of Thaddeus Blight, the maltster, still shimmered before her, his previous tale of the peasant rebellion, born of salt and windows and numerically unsound fury, lingering like the faint scent of old smoke. Eleanor, a woman of meticulous figures, found herself increasingly captivated by the peculiar, tragicomic narrative of the ghost's fiscal torment. His suffering, though centuries removed, felt oddly contemporary, mirroring the enduring absurdities of taxation. "You speak of patterns, Master Blight," Eleanor finally said, her voice a low murmur of the crown's insatiable appetite, constant throughout the ages. "Were there other entries in your personal ledger of Lamentations that illustrated this enduring truth. Thaddeus Blight's translucent form solidified slightly, a faint, almost visible shimmer of contemplation passing through him. A low, soft moan, no longer one of despair but of ancient, dry amusement, escaped his ethereal lips. Other entries, accountant? My spectral existence is a ledger, perpetually open, its pages filled with the grim humor of fiscal folly. Each breath I take, each moment I linger in this purgatory, is a testament to the myriad ways in which the Crown, throughout history, has found new and baffling methods to extract coin from the common man, and often from the very air he breathes, or the hat upon his head. As he spoke, a faint, iridescent glow began to coalesce beside him. Slowly, ponderously, a tome began to form in the empty air, woven from moonlight and sorrow, its binding a dark, spectral leather, its pages seemingly translucent vellum. It was Thaddeus Blight's personal, ghostly ledger, its cover faintly etched with the words Lamentations of T. Blight Maltster, an account of unjust impositions. He extended a wispy, transparent hand, and, with a motion that disturbed not a single dust mote, seemed to flip open its spectral cover. A dry, rustling sound, like leaves skittering across a long-abandoned path, emanated from the ethereal pages. "Let us turn, then," Thaddeus whispered, his spectral finger hovering over the first shimmering entry, "to the folly of the hat tax." Oh, the hat tax! A truly inspired piece of legislative absurdity, introduced in the late 17th century. It decreed that every man who wore a hat, which was, naturally, every man with a modicum of decency and a desire to keep the rain off his pate, must pay a levy. Not simply a flat fee, mind you, for that would be too simple, too numerically transparent. No, the tax was levied according to the EGU value of the hat. A humble cap, a few pence. A finer felt hat, a shilling. But a truly fashionable hat, with a broad brim and a buckle, that could cost you several shillings. A king's ransom for a poor man. The ghost's form rippled with a familiar, weary exasperation. I, in my modesty, wore a plain, sensible felt hat, purchased for a few coppers at the local market. It was sturdy. It kept the sun from my eyes during harvest, and the rain from my face during winter. It was, by all accounts, a hat of no particular value beyond its utility. But then Master Humphrey Pumble, the local hat tax assessor, arrived. A man whose head seemed to contain less gray matter than the felt of my own hat. He peered at my hat, his brow furrowed in concentration. "Master Blight," he declared, his voice puffed with self-importance, "this brim, it possesses a certain flourishing, and the felt, though plain, has a remarkable density. I must, for the integrity of the Crown's revenue, declare this a hat of superior common grade, bordering on minor gentry status." Thaddeus Blight moaned, a sound that conveyed the agony of a man unjustly elevated in fiscal status. Superior common. It was a peasant's hat, elifalet, worn thin from years of honest toil. But Pumble, that purblind idiot, saw flourish where there was merely a well-worn curve, and density where there was merely accumulated grime from the malt house. My hat tax, levied on an object that barely covered my ears, quadrupled overnight. I tried to argue, to demonstrate the utter lack of luxury in my humble headwear. I even offered to wear a tattered cap from my grandfather's day, but Pumble merely shook his head. "The assessment has been made, Master Blight. The ledger entry is final. You wear a hat of superior commonality, and thus you shall pay for it." Eleanor listened, a faint, wry smile touching her lips. The arbitrary interpretation, the unyielding nature of the official decree, it was all too familiar. "So, even your headwear was subject to the Crown's creative accounting," she mused. Did you perhaps try to avoid the tax by going bareheaded? I did, accountant, I did. Thaddeus wailed, his spectral hand sweeping across his incorporeal head. For a full month, I braved the elements, my scalp freezing in the winter winds, my eyes squinting in the summer sun, all to prove the absurdity of the levy. But then, a new decree was issued, a naked head levy, targeting those who dared to defy the hat tax by refusing to wear one. It was a tax on defiance itself, illipholit, a tax on the very freedom of one's scalp. I tell you, the crown leaves no stone unturned, no hair untaxed. Thaddeus Blight's spectral finger swept across the translucent page of his ledger, turning to a new entry. A faint, almost imperceptible warmth seemed to emanate from the page, quickly replaced by a profound chill. And then the candle tax. A truly illuminating example of how the crown taxes the very necessities of life. Every candle manufactured, every tiny flame that banished the gloom from a peasant's cottage was subject to a duty. It was a tax on light, illipholit, a direct levy on the ability to see one's hand in front of one's face after sunset. My wife, Ilara, used to work by the dimmest flicker, her eyes aching, all to save the few precious farthings that would otherwise be claimed by the crown. Children, trying to read their primers, strained their eyes in the perpetual twilight, for fear of incurring the candle tax. He moaned, a low, sorrowful hum. One night, Master Elias, the candle tax collector, a man whose face was as perpetually gloomy as the houses he visited, arrived at my cottage unannounced. He found Ilara mending by a solitary, half-burnt tallow candle, its wick barely glowing. He peered at it, his eyes narrowed. Master Blight, he declared, this candle. It is burning at a rate inconsistent with average household consumption. It appears to be a particularly efficient candle, thereby providing more illumination per unit of wax, and thus, by the Crown's decree of 1709, it is deemed a superior illuminant and subject to a higher duty. Eleanor stared, her mouth slightly agape. A tax on the efficiency of a candle. It was absurd beyond belief. A superior illuminant? She repeated, trying to suppress a giggle. Precisely, Thaddeus wailed, his spectral hand passing through the ethereal candle on his ledger page. My wife's careful trimming of the wick, her meticulous preservation of the tallow, her very frugality, was deemed an act of tax evasion. Her diligence in making a humble candle last longer was considered a luxury worthy of greater imposition. I tried to explain that it was merely good husbandry, the common sense of a poor woman trying to make ends meet. But Elias merely pointed to his ledger. The rate of consumption, Master Blight, dictates the tax. If your candle defies the common rate, it must be of superior quality, or else you are attempting to defraud the crown of its rightful revenue. We were forced to extinguish it to sit in darkness, rather than incur further fines for my wife's superior wick trimming skills. The profound absurdity of it hung in the air, a testament to the sheer, unthinking breadth of the crown's tax policies. Thaddeus then seemed to turn another page, a solemn, almost reverent rustle emanating from the spectral parchment. This time, no light, no warmth, no particular scent accompanied the entry, but a profound, chilling silence, broken only by Thaddeus' low, resonant whisper. And finally, illipholit, the most insidious of all, the one that seals my eternal torment, the epitaph-length tax, Titantenary. Oh, yes. In the latter years of the 17th century, the Crown, in its eternal wisdom and bottomless hunger, decreed that even death itself should be a source of revenue. A tax was placed on the length of one's gravestone inscription. A simple name and date, a few shillings, but a longer epitaph, commemorating virtues, lamenting loss, extolling the deceased's life that my dear accountant cost dearly. The longer the praise, the heavier the tax. It was a tax on remembrance, a duty on grief, a levy on the very act of preserving one's memory beyond the grave. Thaddeus Blight's form seemed to shrink, as if reliving his final mortal indignity. I, as you know, died a pauper, branded a tax cheat and an instigator of rustic riot. My wife, Ilara, despite her own destitution, desperately wished for a fitting inscription on my humble grave, a few lines to proclaim my honesty, to clear my name, to perhaps mention my love for her and our children, and my skill as a maltster. She scrimped. She saved. She sold her last few meager possessions, all to afford a few extra words. But the parish clerk, a diligent man named Master Pettigrew, himself a zealous enforcer of the Crown's arbitrary rules, informed her that my desired epitaph, "Here lies Thaddeus Blight Maltster, a man of 10 acres, not 12 and a half, unjustly taxed by a faulty chain and superior foreign barley, whose integrity remained despite the Crown's baseless accusations, was deemed excessively verbose and would incur a tax far beyond her means." The ghost moaned, a sound that conveyed the agony of unsaid truths, of a reputation forever stained by numbers. She was forced to settle for a mere 2 words. Eliphalet, Thaddeus Blight. No dates, no profession, no mention of my family, no whisper of the injustice that consumed me. Just my name, stark and unadorned, a testament to the Crown's final, posthumous victory over my very memory. My lamentations, my grievances, my very existence were truncated, taxed into silence even after death. And so, accountant, I am bound to this realm, not merely by the weight of my outstanding tax liability, but by the weight of my unwritten epitaph. The words that could not be uttered, the truth that could not be etched, because the Crown taxed the very ink and stone that would have proclaimed it. Thaddeus Blight's spectral ledger seemed to snap shut with an inaudible sigh, its iridescent glow fading into the ambient blue light of the server room. The pervasive sense of despair returned, profound and ancient, heavy with the weight of centuries of fiscal injustice. Eleanor Van sat in stunned silence, her mind reeling from the sheer, soul-crushing absurdity of the ghost's final tale. The hat tax, the candle tax, and finally, the epitaph-length tax adorning the cork. It was a progression from the ridiculous to the truly tragic, a chilling illustration of how the pursuit of revenue could erode not just livelihoods, but dignity, memory, and even the peace of the dead. "Master Blight," Eleanor whispered, her voice barely audible, "your story, it is a testament not just to bureaucratic error, but to a profound, systemic indifference to the human cost of taxation. The Crown, it seems, has always found a way to extract, even from the unseen, even from the memory." "Indeed." "Accountant," Thaddeus replied, his voice a low, sorrowful echo, "and that is why I linger. For while my earthly ledger remains unbalanced, while my epitaph remains unwritten in the hearts of those who judge by true numbers, I cannot rest. My moans are not merely for my own plight, but for every soul crushed by a phantom tax, every truth silenced by a zealous assessor, every life diminished by the insatiable appetite of the Crown. I am the eternal audit, the perpetual lament, for the truth of the numbers must be known, and the ledger of justice finally balanced." Eleanor looked at her glowing screen. The complex figures of the multinational corporate tax return, now appearing less like an abstract puzzle and more like a modern-day labyrinth, full of hidden epitaph taxes and superior illuminant classifications. The ghost had opened her eyes not just to historical absurdities, but to the timeless, often unseen, injustices woven into the very fabric of fiscal policy. The night was still long, but the task before her, of unpicking the tangled threads of modern corporate finance, now felt imbued with a profound, almost spiritual purpose. She was no longer merely a tax consultant. She was an auditor of truth, a guardian of the numbers. fighting for the balance of the ledgers, both living and spectral. Chapter 10. The Tax Collector's Revenge. The first faint light of a London morning touched Eleanor's office, casting long shadows across the server racks and ergonomic chairs. Thaddeus Blight's spectral form, having imparted its centuries-old wisdom, began to waver, his connection to the living realm loosening. He felt the familiar, gentle pull of the spectral currents, drawing him back into the endless, formless expanse that was his purgatory. It was not a place, precisely, but a state of being. A continuous, mournful awareness of all the numbers that had ever gone awry, all the taxes that had ever been unjustly levied, all the ledgers that had ever been left stubbornly, infuriatingly unbalanced. His lamentations, once confined to the quiet desperation of his own circumstances, had, over centuries, expanded to encompass the entire vast history of fiscal injustice. He was the ghost of every overtaxed soul, every misclassified asset, every phantom deduction. He was the sum total of bureaucratic error. As he drifted, no longer truly anchored to Eleanor's office, the ephemeral currents of the afterlife shifted, carrying him not into oblivion, but into a place that, to his eternal dismay, bore a striking resemblance to the very administrative chambers he had loathed in life. It was a vast, echoing space, limned in perpetual twilight, its air thick with the faint, melancholic rustle of spectral parchment and the ghostly, rhythmic scratch of unseen quills. Impossibly tall stacks of translucent ledgers stretched into the murky distance, their pages filled with shimmering, unreadable script. Figures, like ephemeral fireflies, flitted about, coalescing into brief, impossible sums before dissipating into the gloom. This, Thaddeus realized with a groan that resonated only within his spectral essence, was the afterlife exchequer, the celestial audit office, the eternal bureaucracy of the beyond. And here, in this purgatory of endless accounting, he encountered a familiar, infuriating presence, hovering amidst a particularly dense cluster of shimmering excise records that seemed to pulse with faint, acrid scent of misclassified spirits and phantom malt, was a form instantly recognizable to Thaddeus, even across the veil of death. It was the spectral shape of Percival Grubbins, the customs assessor, the dull-witted pen-pusher whose misjudgment of Thaddeus's barley had condemned him to financial ruin. Grubbins was just as Thaddeus remembered him, corpulent, even in ghostly form, his spectral jowls quivering with an unseen self-importance, his translucent brow perpetually furrowed in a caricature of concentration. He was endlessly, tirelessly, and completely ineffectually sorting through a spectral pile of duty-due notices, his ethereal hands passing through them without consequence, yet his posture radiating an eternal, unyielding bureaucratic seal. Grubbins, Thaddeus wailed, a sound that sliced through the melancholic hum of the afterlife exchequer, carrying centuries of pent-up indignation. Percival Grubbins, you dullard, you purblind idiot. Do you know what you wrought with your superior foreign malting barley assessment? Do you comprehend the torment you inflicted upon a humble maltster with your lack of discernment and your slavish adherence to the letter, rather than the spirit of the royal decree? Grubbins, initially startled, turned his hazy, spectral gaze towards Thaddeus. His ghostly eyes, once merely dull, now held a faint, bewildered flicker, as if perpetually trying to recall a forgotten tax code. Who speaks?" he muttered, his voice a spectral wheeze, like air escaping a punctured bellows. "I'm engaged in the perpetual reassessment of Category B7, subsection Alpha, as per the Crown's eternal mandate. Disturbance of an official assessor in the performance of his duties, even in the afterlife, is a grave breach of celestial protocol and subject to further penalties." He gestured vaguely towards a shimmering, spectral placard that seemed to read, "All spirits found deficient in protocol are subject to further administrative review See Form 7 Alpha Theta Omega, Paragraph 4, Subclause 9. Penalties. Penalties. Thaddeus raged, his own form pulsing with incandescent fury. You speak of penalties, you who condemned me to beggary and an unmarked grave with your incompetence. It was my barley, Grubbins, my domestic humble fee-grade barley, and you, in your infinite idiocy, classified it as superior foreign. You added a tax burden that crushed my family, seized my malt house, and doomed me to this very purgatory of fiscal lamentation. Percival Grubbins squinted, his spectral features twisting into a familiar, self-satisfied smirk. Ah, Master Blight, the maltster. I remember you. A persistent one, even in life. Always arguing, always questioning the Crown's clear and unambiguous decrees. It was not idiocy, Master Blight, but rigorous adherence to the visual characteristics laid out in the Royal Decree on Foreign Goods, 16078. Your kernels, as I recall, were unusually plump, unusually uniform. The very definition of superior foreign, as per official guidelines. The ledger does not lie, Master Blight. The numbers, once entered, are immutable, even in the celestial realm. You had the appearance of a high-value import, and thus you paid the appropriate duty. It was simply the due process of the Crown. Appearance, Thaddeus wailed, his voice rising to a full, echoing moan that seemed to shake the very foundations of the spectral exchequer. It was the result of good husbandry, of unexpected sunshine, of a new experimental fertilizing technique, not an attempt to defraud the Crown. You saw what you wanting to see, Grubbins, what benefited the Crown's coffers, not what was actually there. You were blind to the truth of the grain, just as Finchley was blind to the truth of my land. Truth, Master Blight, is a subjective concept. Grubbins sniffed, his spectral nose seemingly turning up in disdain. But the Crown's figures are not. The Royal Decree was specific on the visual criteria. If a bushel of barley exhibits the characteristics of superior foreign malt, then it is superior foreign malt. Your agricultural experiments are not relevant to fiscal classification. One cannot simply invent a new method of cultivation and expect the Crown to rewrite its tariffs on a whim. That would lead to utter chaos, to a breakdown of the very system. Imagine every farmer claiming unique sunshine or experimental fertilizer as an excuse to avoid due duty. The very fabric of society would unravel. As Grubbins spoke, the surrounding spectral ledgers of the afterlife exchequer seemed to hum with approval. A low, collective murmur of protocol, procedure, immutable figures. Thaddeus felt a familiar, chilling sense of futility wash over him. Even in death, Grubbins remained a quintessential bureaucrat. A man so utterly devoid of independent thought and so completely beholden to the rules that he could not or would not acknowledge his own past errors. His ghost was merely an extension of the system that had crushed Thaddeus in life. And what of Finchley? Thaddeus demanded, shifting his spectral fury. What of Cuthbert Finchley, that blundering boy whose faulty surveying chain conjured 2.5 phantom acres from thin air? Was that due process? Was that rigorous adherence to guidelines? Grubbins waved a dismissive, translucent hand. Surveyor Finchley? A fine young man, diligent, eager to please. His surveys were always certified by the parish registrar. We have no record of defective equipment in his earthly reports, Master Blight. The Crown does not issue faulty equipment. To suggest otherwise is seditious, even in this realm. Your land was officially recorded as 12.5 acres. End of matter. Your continued insistence on a faulty chain is merely a desperate attempt to avoid your lawful, albeit belated, celestial obligations. And your constant moaning, I might add, is disrupting the serene atmosphere required for proper spectral accounting. My moaning is the sound of eternal injustice. Thaddeus roared, his spectral form vibrating with such force that a nearby stack of unpaid heavenly indulgences briefly shimmered and almost toppled. My entire afterlife is an audit of your incompetence and the Crown's tyranny. I cannot rest because your figures remain unchallenged. Because my ledger, the ledger of my life, is still unbalanced by your errors. Grubbins, however, seemed utterly immune to Thaddeus's impassioned plea. He simply pursed his translucent lips, adjusting his spectral spectacles. Unbalanced? Master Blight, your earthly ledger was settled. Your debts, however reluctantly, were paid. Your malt house, your fields, all were forfeit. The Crown, as ever, ensured its dues were met. There is no outstanding balance for you, save for the spiritual interest accruing on your continued insolence and non-compliance with the celestial tranquility protocols. But it was unjust. Thaddeus wailed, a fresh wave of despair washing over him. The payment was coerced. The seizure was illegal. My accounts were false. The Duke's unpaid dues were blamed upon me. Do you not see the grander deception? Grubbins scoffed, a dry, spectral sound that held no humor. The Duke of Ravenswood, a man of significant means. His Grace always settled his accounts eventually. His tax strategies were complex, certainly, but always within the bounds of clever interpretation. Your involvement, as I recall from the earthly reports, was merely one of clerical assistance in a minor, misguided attempt to, shall we say, optimize his liabilities. A rather pathetic endeavor, if I may be so bold. Your own modest overassessments were a mere trifle compared to the Duke's true wealth, and the Crown, as ever, pursued the larger sums. Your lament, Master Blight, is disproportionate to the actual numerical impact. Thaddeus felt a cold, crushing weight settle upon his spectral being. Disproportionality. Vanity. That was it. That was the core of it. Grubbins, the system, could not comprehend the personal toll, the destruction of a life, when the numbers themselves, in their vast, impersonal totality, seemed insignificant. To the bureaucracy, Thaddeus's ruin was a statistical anomaly, an acceptable margin of error in the grand scheme of revenue collection. His agony was merely a disruption to the serene atmosphere of celestial accounting. You are as blind in death as you were in life, Grubbins, Thaddeus cried, his voice breaking with sheer frustration. You see only the numbers on the page, never the lives they destroy, never the truth behind the figures. My torment is not disproportionate. It is the sum of every small injustice, compounded by your unyielding, unthinking adherence to flawed procedure. You are nothing but a ghost of a ledger entry, a phantom of bureaucratic indifference. Percival Grubbins, however, remained unmoved. His spectral form seemed to stiffen, radiating a chilling aura of self-righteousness. I am the eternal embodiment of proper procedure, Master Blight. My duty, then as now, is to ensure the orderly collection of dues. Your emotional outbursts, however, are not conducive to the balancing of ethereal accounts. I suggest you consult the Celestial Grievance Tribunal, Form Omega-9 Upsilon. They might be able to process your feelings, though I warn you, the backlog is considerable, and the processing fees are substantial, even for spectral appeals. Now, if you'll excuse me, I must return to the reclassification of spectral import duties on unseen astral dust, a most pressing matter. Grubbins turned his back on Thaddeus, his spectral hands once again passing through the shimmering excise records, muttering under his breath about translucent tariffs and unverifiable astral provenance. Thaddeus Blight floated there, utterly defeated, even in the afterlife. The bureaucracy held sway. The very ghost of the man who had ruined him was still a slave to the system, incapable of admitting fault, unable to see beyond the cold, hard facts of the ledger. There would be no vindication here, no posthumous apology, no rebalancing of the cosmic scales by the hands of his tormentor. The tax collector's revenge was not active malice, but passive indifference, the eternal, unyielding nature of bureaucratic error, even in death. A profound, soul-deep moan escaped Thaddeus, louder and more sorrowful than any he had uttered before. It was not a moan for his own plight alone, but for the inherent, timeless futility of fighting an unthinking, unfeeling system. He understood now, with chilling clarity, that the peace he sought could not come from the acknowledgement of his persecutors, for they were merely reflections of the system itself. His hope, faint as it was, now truly lay with the living, with someone like Eliphalet Finch or Eleanor Vance, who still possessed the capacity for independent thought, for truth, and for the courageous act of balancing a ledger not just by its numbers, but by its justice. The spectral exchequer, with its endless, meaningless tasks and its unyielding, ghostly clerks, was a testament to the fact that some curses transcended even the grave, particularly those born of misplaced zeal and numerical pedantry. Thaddeus turned, leaving Grubbins to his eternal, pointless reclassification of spectral import duties, and allowed the shifting currents of the afterlife to pull him away, back towards the faint, flickering lights of the living world, where perhaps, just perhaps, true rectification still had a ghost of a chance. Chapter 11. The eternal loophole, the currents of the spectral realm, those invisible tides that ebb and flow through the vast, unquantifiable expanse of the afterlife, pulled Thaddeus Blight away from the infuriatingly familiar presence of Percival Grubbins. The afterlife exchequer, with its shimmering, unreadable ledgers, and its endless, pointless reclassifications of astral dust, faded into the twilight mists, leaving Thaddeus with a familiar, profound sense of futility. Grubbins, in his unyielding adherence to procedural error, was merely a facet of the greater cosmic bureaucracy that held Thaddeus captive. Arguing with him was like attempting to persuade a spreadsheet to admit its own coding error, utterly pointless and profoundly draining to the spectral spirit. Thaddeus floated, a mere wisp of sorrow and numerical grievance, amidst the silent echoes of forgotten decrees and the phantom rustle of unfiled forms. His purgatory was not one of fire or ice, but of an eternal, unyielding administrative limbo, a place where every unanswered petition, every unacknowledged error, every forgotten farthing in an old tax ledger resonated with an unbearable, monotonous ache. He had spent centuries in this state, observing, always observing, the endless stream of souls that passed through the celestial gates, each carrying their own burdens, their own unresolved earthly affairs. Most were concerned with matters of love, betrayal, vengeance, or unfulfilled dreams. But Thaddeus, forever bound to the mundane, found his attention drawn, always, to the fiscal. He watched as spirits, once corporeal, struggled to make sense of the final accountings presented to them by the ethereal gatekeepers. He saw the bewildered expressions of souls burdened by spiritual inheritance taxes levied on talents they had neglected in life, or the temporal property rates assessed on time ill spent. It was all so vast, so bewildering, and to Thaddeus, so utterly prone to similar fundamental errors as the earthly system he knew. And then, slowly, imperceptibly at first, a pattern began to emerge. A faint, shimmering inconsistency in the very fabric of the afterlife's tax code. His torment, he knew, was tied to the G-Crown's 8 figures, to the girthling ledgers that branded him as a tax defaulter and an accomplice to grander fraud. His spirit was not held by divine judgment, but by a bureaucratic hold, a metaphysical lien on his soul, rooted in the terrestrial records of the exchequer. The key, He realized with a flicker of spectral insight that felt like a spark of life, lay not in arguing with the afterlife's own, equally unyielding bureaucracy, but in undermining the very foundation of the earthly claim that bound him. He had always known that his unjust taxation stemmed from two primary errors: Cuthbert Finchley's faulty surveying chain and Percival Grubbin's misclassification of his barley. These errors were officially recorded in the Crown's ledgers, sealed by the signatures of the assessors and upheld by the commissioners. But what if, Thaddeus mused, his spectral form pulsing with a newfound fragile hope, the source of the error, the instrument itself, could be undeniably proven faulty in the living world? What if the very basis of the Crown's claim was fundamentally discredited by its own earthly descendants? The afterlife, he had observed, was remarkably reliant on earthly precedent, especially concerning matters of property and fiscal obligation. The celestial gatekeepers often consulted spectral copies of earthly deeds, wills, and, most damningly for Thaddeus, tax assessments. Their own celestial calculations were, it seemed, often merely a mirror of the most recent, official earthly records. This was the crux of his curse. If the earthly record proclaimed him a defaulter, then so too did the celestial. But if the earthly record could be corrected, the loophole, as Thaddeus began to perceive it, was not a grand philosophical escape clause. It was far more mundane, far more bureaucratic. It was predicated on the unstated assumption of the Crown's infallibility. The earthly Crown, and by extension, its celestial echo, believed its own records to be unimpeachable. They would not admit to faulty equipment or incompetent assessors or selective blindness. But what if, through diligent, undeniable proof presented in the living worlding, the truth of the faulty chain, the true nature of his barley, and the Duke's true culpability could be so overwhelmingly established that even the Crown's current living representatives would be forced to acknowledge the historical error? It was a long shot, a numerical needle in a cosmic haystack. For centuries, he had tried to whisper his grievances into the ears of living clerks, but they had always dismissed him as a draft, or a troubled mind. But then came Eliphalet Finch, a man who not only listened but understood him, a man who possessed the meticulousness, the dedication to numerical truth, to truly unravel the ancient errors. And Eliphalet had proposed using the printing press, a concept Thaddeus had barely grasped in life, but one that resonated with immense power in the afterlife, a tool capable of spreading truth beyond the confines of a single sealed ledger. The eternal loophole, Thaddeus concluded, was this: his torment was sustained by the unacknowledged error in the living record. If Eliphalet Finch or his modern counterpart Eleanor Vance could gather sufficient, undeniable evidence not just whispered to sleeping clerks, but published for all the world to see, making the historical injustice a matter of public, undeniable record, then the very foundation of the Crown's claim upon his soul might crumble. If the living Crown, through its institutions and historians, was forced to retrospectively acknowledge that Cuthbert Finchley's chain was indeed faulty, that Percival Grubbins did misclassify his barley, and that the Duke of Ravenswood's tax evasion was falsely attributed to Thaddeus Blight, then the debt that bound his soul would become, metaphysically, null and void. Not because the afterlife system was merciful, but because its source data, the earthly Crown's official numbers, had been demonstrably proven false. He imagined the effect, the spectral ledger, his personal lamentations, shimmering with a new light. The false entries for 12.5 acres and superior foreign malting barley, flickering, dissolving, replaced by the true figures of 10 acres and domestic feed grade. The branding of tax cheat and Duke's accomplice etched upon his spectral being might finally fade, replaced by unjustly burdened maltster, or simply Thaddeus Blight, at peace. It would not be an act of forgiveness, but an act of auditing, a celestial rebalancing based on new, accurate earthly data. But the loophole was narrow, treacherous. It relied on the living, on the persistence of a dedicated accountant, across centuries. And it relied on the crown, even its historical shadow, to concede error, a feat almost as improbable in the living world as it was in the afterlife. The bureaucratic mind, whether corporeal or ethereal, clung fiercely to its established figures, its signed documents, its inherent belief in its own infallible processes. He had witnessed the stubbornness of Grubbins firsthand. Would the living be any different? Still, it was hope, a thin, bureaucratic thread of it. His moans, which had been the automatic expression of his continuous suffering, might, for the first time in centuries, begin to shift. They might still contain the memory of injustice, the bitter echo of past fiscal woes, for that was his very nature. But they would no longer be the desperate cries of a soul still shackled by a false debt. They would become the weary sighs of a ghost, finally, irrevocably, approaching its final balanced ledger. The possibility of such a rectification, so profoundly mundane yet so cosmically significant, gave Thaddeus a subtle buoyancy. He was no longer drifting aimlessly in the sea of bureaucratic limbo. He had a destination, a final audit to compel. His task was to remain connected to the living world, to continue his mournful presence, to guide the meticulous hands of accountants like Eliphalet and Eleanor, until the truth, the precise, numerical, undeniable truth of his existence, was finally, universally acknowledged on earth. Only then, when the foundational lie was dismantled in the realm of the living, could the celestial records, and by extension, his tortured soul, finally be set free. The loophole was there, but it required a very specific, very human intervention. It required someone to truly listen to a ghost who only moaned about taxes, and then to act upon those most boring, yet most profound, of grievances. And as he thought of Eliphalet, with his earnest Quill, and Eleanor, with her glowing screen, a faint, almost imperceptible shimmer of anticipation pulsed through his spectral form. The game was not yet over. The ledgers of the world were still open, awaiting final, honest entries. Chapter 12. The Haunting of HMRC. The spectral currents, those silent, formless rivers of the afterlife, had carried Thaddeus Blight away from the profound solace of Eliphalet Finch's meticulous calculations, and later, from the bewildering glow of Eleanor Vance's modern office. His encounter with Percival Grubbins in the afterlife exchequer had solidified his understanding. The bureaucracy of the beyond was as unyielding and as blind to nuance as its earthly counterpart. His hope, a flickering ember in the vast, numerical void, now rested entirely upon the living, upon the possibility that honest accountants, armed with truth and the power of dissemination, might posthumously rectify the egregious errors that bound his soul. But simply whispering his grievances to a select few, however understanding they might be, felt insufficient. His torment was public, recorded in official ledgers, and therefore its rectification must also be public, undeniable, and, perhaps, a little bit irritating to the very institutions that perpetuated it. He needed to make his case, not just to a sympathetic ear, but to the very heart of the modern tax machine. And so, Thaddeus Blight, the ghost that only moaned about taxes, found himself drawn to the colossal, unassuming edifice of Her Majesty's Revenue and Customs, a building of bland, gray concrete and smoked glass nestled incongruously among more historic London architecture. It was a place where the very air seemed to hum with the low-grade anxiety of approaching deadlines, and the quiet despair of those who wrestled with complex forms. The interior was a labyrinth of cubicles, glowing computer screens, and the soft, ceaseless click of keyboards. The scent, alien to his 17th century sensibilities, was a sterile blend of recycled air, cheap disinfectant, and the faint, almost metallic tang of overworked electronics. It was a cathedral of contemporary fiscal administration, and to Thaddeus it was a target rich with numerical injustices, both ancient and nascent. He drifted through the thick, electronically controlled doors, unnoticed by the few late working clerks who remained. The hour was, predictably, well past closing, the sort of time when only the most diligent or the most burdened still clung to their desks. Thaddeus found himself drawn to a particular cubicle. Its inhabitant, a young man named Gary, whose spectacles were perched precariously on his nose, much like Eliphalit's, and whose face was a mask of profound, concentrated bewilderment. Gary was wrestling with a particularly thorny corporate income tax return, trying to reconcile a series of offshore deductions with a recent change in international tax treaties. He muttered to himself, a low, frustrated growl. Thaddeus hovered just behind Gary's chair, observing the glowing screen with a mixture of awe and profound, anachronistic confusion. He saw numbers, flashing and shifting, appearing and disappearing with a speed that defied the steady permanence of ink on vellum. What witchcraft is this? He moaned, his voice a low, mournful whisper that seemed to eddy around Gary's ears like a sudden draft. These figures, they exist only as light. Where is the tangible asset? Where is the physical coin? How can one audit a shadow? Gary shivered, rubbing his arms. Must be the air conditioning again. Or perhaps too much lukewarm coffee. He adjusted his headset, which played faint, soothing classical music designed to improve concentration, but which only served to irritate Thaddeus, who preferred the rhythmic scratch of a quill. Thaddeus decided a more direct approach was warranted, though still within the bounds of his spectral limitations. He drifted closer to Gary's screen. The problem, young accountant, is not in the numbers themselves, but in their very immateriality. How can you truly grasp the truth of a transaction when it is merely a fleeting luminescence? It breeds deceit, I tell you. In my day we dealt with tangible goods, with actual land, measured by a chain, though some chains, I must add, were faulty, leading to 2.5 phantom acres that still haunt my soul. Phantom acres. Do you comprehend the audacity? Gary jumped, dropping his pen with a clatter. He whipped his head around, his eyes wide behind his smudged spectacles. Who's there? He stammered, his voice thin with exhaustion. He scanned the empty cubicles, the silent rows of desks stretching into the fluorescent gloom. Nothing. He bent to retrieve his pen, his heart thumping a little faster than usual. Too much stress, he decided. Tax season always did this to him. Thaddeus, frustrated by the mortal's obtuseness, decided to simplify his grievance, perhaps appealing to common experience. And the hat tax, he moaned, his voice rising slightly, taking on a tone of aggrieved lecturing. Do you, young Gary, wear a hat? For if you do, consider the profound injustice of a levy assessed not merely on its existence, but on its perceived WOG value. My sensible felt hat, useful for keeping the sun from my eyes, was deemed superior common grade by a purblind assessor named Pumble, leading to a quadrupling of my humble tax. A tax on a hat. A tax on the very decision to protect one's pate from the elements. Is there no end to the Crown's rapacity? Gary, having retrieved his pen, froze again, his hand hovering over his keyboard. He distinctly heard a voice, low and mournful, speaking of a hat tax and a purblind assessor. He looked around slowly, his neck craning, his heart now thudding in his ears. Did someone say hat tax? He whispered into the empty air. He must be hallucinating. The stress was truly getting to him. Thaddeus, encouraged by this faint glimmer of recognition, pressed on. And the candle tax, a duty on light itself. My wife, Elara, striving to save a few farthings, trimmed her wick with meticulous care, making a humble tallow candle burn longer. And what was her reward, accountant? A visit from Master Elias, the candle tax collector, who declared her candle a superior illuminant due to its unnatural efficiency and levied a higher duty. Her frugality deemed an act of tax evasion. We were forced to sit in darkness, rather than incur further fines for my wife's commendable wick-trimming skills. Do you, in this modern age, levy a tax on the efficient consumption of electricity? On the brightness of your digital screens, perhaps? For it is the same principle. I tell you, the Crown taxes the very air, the very light, the very ingenuity of its citizens. Gary, now trembling, gripped the edge of his desk. His rational mind screamed at him that he was alone in the office, but the mournful voice, imbued with such specific anachronistic grievance, was undeniable. He had heard of old obscure taxes, but a candle tax on superior illuminance. It was too bizarre, too detailed, to be a mere figment of his imagination. He fumbled for his mouse, his fingers shaking as he tried to navigate to his internal HR portal. Maybe he should report this. A potential security breach? Or a mental health crisis? Thaddeus, frustrated by Gary's lack of engagement with the core fiscal principle, drifted closer, his form pulsing with a familiar ancient exasperation. He passed through a stack of neatly filed VAT returns. The epitaph-length tax, then. The most grievous of all. Do you comprehend the cruelty of taxing remembrance itself? Of levying a duty on the words etched upon a man's gravestone? My poor Ilara, after my death, wished for a modest inscription clearing my name of the Crown's baseless accusations. Here lies Thaddeus Blight Maltster, a man of 10 acres, not 12.5, unjustly taxed by a faulty chain and superior foreign barley, whose integrity remained despite the Crown's baseless accusations. But Master Pettigrew, the parish clerk, deemed it excessively verbose, and the tax for such a truthful, albeit lengthy, epitaph was beyond her means. She was forced to settle for a mere 2 words. Thaddeus Blight. My lamentations, silenced even in death by the greed of the Crown. Do you tax the digital obituaries now? The very characters in an online eulogy? For the principal, accountant, is the same. A tax on memory. A levy on grief. Gary let out a strangled gasp. He could feel the cold radiating from the spot near his desk, a cold that spoke of ancient mundane sorrow. His hair stood on end. He was hearing things, or seeing things. He pinched himself hard. No, he was awake, and a ghost, a very boring, very tax-obsessed ghost, was lecturing him on 17th century burial taxes. He slowly, carefully, began to back his chair away from the desk, his eyes darting towards the emergency exit. Thaddeus, mistaking Gary's retreat for a sign of deep thought, pursued him, his spectral form passing effortlessly through the cubicle wall. And the Duke's unpaid dues, he continued, his voice taking on a new urgency that truly cemented my fate. His Grace, Duke Alaric of Ravenswood, a man of vast wealth, declared his crops blighted and his French wines medicinal tonics to avoid his taxes. And when the Crown's assessors came calling, that quivering Master Quill, the Duke's steward, and me, a humble maltster, for his fabricated accounts. My soul, when I died, was branded not just with my own unjust arrears, but with the Duke's fictional debt, a debt that covered his cunning and the Crown's selective blindness. Do your modern corporations, young Gary, with their research and development credits and their offshore subsidiaries, not engage in the very same elaborate deceptions, merely cloaked in more sophisticated terminology? The essence of the evasion, accountant, is eternal. The powerful evade, and the burden falls upon the honest, or the conveniently available scapegoat. Gary was now pressed against the far wall of his cubicle, breathing heavily, his eyes wide with a mixture of terror and impossibly of incomprehension. bis hondige to the hand, den besim konkankai. The Duke of Ravenswood. Blighted crops. Medicinal tonics. Offshore subsidiaries. R&D credits. It was all so absurd. Yet the ghost's anachronistic lamentations were drawing chillingly precise parallels to the very corporate tax strategies he wrestled with daily. The ghost wasn't just moaning. It was offering deeply cynical, historically informed tax advice. Thaddeus seeing a flicker of understanding in Gary's eyes, even if it was tinged with sheer panic, felt a strange surge of spectral energy. He pressed his point, his form becoming slightly more distinct. The system, accountant, is designed to perpetuate itself, to extract maximum revenue, and to admit no error. My 2.5 phantom acres, conjured by a faulty chain, remain uncorrected in the cosmic ledger. My honest barley, deemed superior foreign by an idiot assessor, still bears that false classification. And the Duke's unpaid dues for which I was blamed cling to my spirit like an eternal audit. You in this new age, with your glowing screens and your vast, unseen networks of data, have the power to reveal these truths, to make the numbers reflect reality, not convenient fictions. For the ledger of justice, young Gary, demands an honest balance, even across the veil of time. Gary slid down the wall, landing in a crumpled heap on the linoleum floor. He wasn't screaming. He wasn't even crying. He was just staring, utterly overwhelmed by the sheer, mundane horror of being haunted by a 17th-century tax ghost who knew more about the systemic flaws of modern corporate taxation than he did. He suddenly saw his complex spreadsheets not as neutral data, but as potential instruments of historical injustice, brimming with phantom acres and superior foreign barley of the digital age. His mind, usually a neatly ordered series of fiscal calculations, felt like a ledger that had spontaneously combusted. Thaddeus Blight, his spectral energy momentarily depleted by this intense exposition, began to fade slightly, a low, mournful hum emanating from his translucent form. His message, however specific and anachronistic, had been delivered. He had, he hoped, planted a seed of doubt, a whisper of historical truth, into the mind of a modern tax clerk. His moans, which had once been cries of despair, were slowly, subtly, becoming pedagogical, a persistent, boring lecture from beyond the grave, designed to prick the conscience of the living, to remind them that the numbers had a history, and that history, left uncorrected, could haunt souls for centuries. As Gary lay on the floor contemplating his sudden, profound new understanding of tax ethics, Thaddeus Blight, the ghost that only moaned about taxes, drifted out of the HMRC office, leaving behind only the lingering scent of ancient parchment and the indelible impression of an incredibly boring, yet utterly compelling, haunting. His search for the eternal loophole continued, one unsuspecting tax professional at a time. Chapter 13. The final deduction, the ephemeral currents of the afterlife. Those silent, formless rivers that carried souls through the vast, unquantifiable expanse of the spiritual realm, felt different to Thaddeus Blight. No longer was he pulled aimlessly through the twilight mists of forgotten decrees and unfiled forms. Instead, there was a definite, deliberate current, a sense of inexorable motion drawing him towards a singular, profound destination. He knew it in his spectral core, with the same certainty he once knew the precise yield of a field of barley. This was it. This was the ultimate reckoning, the celestial audit that would finally determine his eternal financial karma. He had faced Grubbins, the ghost of bureaucratic indifference, and found no solace. His only hope, a fragile ember kindled by the meticulousness of Eliphalet Finch and the quiet understanding of Eleanor Vance, lay in the truth of the numbers. and the possibility that somewhere in the vast cosmic ledger, justice still held sway. He drifted through a shimmering, translucent archway, its ethereal keystone marked with symbols he could not quite decipher, yet which felt profoundly ancient, imbued with the weight of universal accountancy. The air here was not thick with rustling parchment, nor humming with digital thrum, but resonated with a sound like a million distant abacuses clicking in perfect harmonious synchronicity. Before him stretched an infinite expanse, a boundless chamber of pure, crystalline light, yet without source, without shadow. Impossibly tall columns of what appeared to be solidified starlight rose into an unseen ceiling, each column composed of countless interlocked, glowing numerals. This was not the afterlife exchequer, with its dreary, earth-bound echoes. This was the celestial tribunal of final reckoning, the supreme court of cosmic accountancy, a place where all figures were truly absolute. At the heart of this luminous expanse, seated behind a single, vast, shimmering table spun from pure light, sat three figures. They were not human, not precisely. They were beings of pure, concentrated numerical essence, their forms composed of swirling constellations of prime numbers and geometric patterns that shifted and reformed with silent, elegant precision. Their faces, if they possessed such things, were simply focal points of intense, impartial light, their gaze encompassing everything and nothing, all at once. Before each of them floated a single, immense, luminous ledger, its pages turning silently, revealing endless columns of light script. These were the auditors of eternity, the keepers of the cosmic balance, beings whose existence was entirely predicated on the immutable truth of figures. Thaddeus Blight, the ghost that only moaned about taxes, felt a wave of profound apprehension. His earthly grievances, so consuming in life and so persistent in death, suddenly felt small, almost insignificant, before the sheer, overwhelming impartiality of these beings. He was just a monster, a man tormented by phantom acres and misclassified barley. What could he say to beings who measured the very fabric of existence in integers and algorithms? A voice, resonating not through the air but directly within his spectral core, spoke. It was not a single voice, but a chorus of harmonious numbers, calm, authoritative, and utterly devoid of emotion. Spirit of Thaddeus Blight, formerly of Kent, earthly realm, your essence bears the mark of an outstanding fiscal imbalance. Your lamentations, broadcast across temporal dimensions, have registered. You seek a final deduction, a reckoning of your eternal financial karma. State your plea and present your accounts. Thaddeus surprisingly found his spectral voice, strengthened by centuries of grievance and the distant memory of Eliphalet's unwavering belief in the truth of numbers. He focused not on the vastness of his surroundings, but on the meticulous details, the very essence of his torment. Honorable auditors of eternity, he began, his voice, though still mournful, gaining a new, defiant clarity. My plea is for truth, for the rectification of figures unjustly applied. My eternal torment stems not from a true deficit, but from a false imputation, a bureaucratic curse rooted in the earthly realm. He began with the land. In the year of our Lord 1679, my humble plot of 10 acres, documented since my grandfather's time in the parish registry of 1665, was, by the blundering of a newly appointed surveyor named Cuthbert Finchley, and the fundamental flaw of his instrument, a surveying chain with an elongated link declared to be 12.5 acres, 2.5 phantom acres conjured from error, which then formed the basis for an inflated land tax. The Crown, in its infinite wisdom, refused to acknowledge the defect in its own implement, declaring its ledgers infallible. As Thaddeus spoke, one of the luminous auditors, a being composed primarily of geometric patterns, turned its gaze towards a section of its vast, glowing ledger. Columns of numbers shimmered, and then a faint, almost imperceptible pulsation rippled through an entry labeled Blight T. Land Assessment, 1679, Durch. It was not a judgment, merely an acknowledgment of the data's presence, and perhaps its inconsistency. The rhythmic clicking of the cosmic abacuses seemed to shift, subtly, as if adjusting for a minor perturbation. Thaddeus, emboldened by this silent attention, pressed on. And my barley, my own domestic feed-grade barley, coaxed to plumpness by diligent husbandry and an unexpected period of sunshine. Percival Grubbins, the customs assessor, a man whose intellect was as dense as a brick of cured peat, declared it superior foreign malting barley, subject to an exorbitant excise duty. He relied solely on superficial appearance, ignoring all proof of its domestic origin, all testimony from honest maltsters. My ingenuity was deemed an act of tax evasion, my very livelihood seized, my family beggared, all because of his purblind adherence to a flawed visual classification. The second auditor, whose form seemed to swirl with complex equations, directed its luminous gaze towards another section of its ledger. An entry for Blight T. Excise Duty, 1679, pulsed faintly, and a low, harmonious hum permeated the chamber, a sound that, to Thaddeus, felt like the cosmic equivalent of a deeply thoughtful, yet exasperated, sigh. The phantom acrid scent of misclassified grain, a smell that had haunted him for centuries, seemed to dissipate slightly. Then, Thaddeus's spectral form stiffened, the old shame and rage returning, but tempered now with the clarity of his understanding. And then the ultimate branding, my brief, desperate service to his grace, Duke Alaric of Ravenswood, whose vast fortune was shielded by fabricated blights and medicinal tonics for his ailing health. When the crown's assessors descended upon his manor, Master Quill, the Duke's steward, conveniently pointed to me, a humble, starving maltster, as the preparer of the Duke's falsified accounts. My name, already stained by the phantom acres and misclassified barley, was irrevocably branded with the Duke's vast fictional debt. I became a scapegoat, a lephilite, a convenient blot on the Crown's ledger to cover the cunning of the powerful. The third auditor, its form a shimmering helix of geometric progression, seemed to slow its internal calculations. A profound, almost contemplative silence fell over the tribunal. The individual numbers forming its essence ceased their frenetic dance, settling into a pattern of solemn, unchanging integers. This, Thaddeus sensed, was the gravest charge, the deepest injustice, for it spoke not merely of error, but of cynical intent, of the bending of numbers to serve power. Furthermore, Thaddeus continued, driven by centuries of accumulated indignity, my very attempts to exist were taxed. The hat tax, levied on my sensible felt hat, deemed superior common by an idiot assessor. The candle tax, my wife's meticulous wick trimming, her very frugality, deemed an act of luxury, a superior illuminant to be taxed more heavily, forcing us into darkness. And the epitaph-length tax, the cruelest of all, my poor Elara, forbidden from inscribing the truth of my unjust fate upon my gravestone, forced to settle for a mere Thaddeus blight, lest the crown tax my very memory into silence. My lamentations, my spirit's perpetual moan, are but the echoes of these truths, denied, dismissed, and buried beneath layers of bureaucratic lies. A profound, resonant hum filled the chamber, the collective sound of the three auditors. It was not a sound of judgment, but of deep, intricate calculation, as if the very fabric of cosmic reality was being re-evaluated, rebalanced. Thaddeus felt a strange lightness permeate his being, a sensation he had not known since before his torment began. The heavy, cold sensation of the cursed Quill that had weighed upon his spectral form for centuries began to dissipate, replaced by a gentle warmth. The chorus of numerical voices, calm and impartial, spoke again. Spirit of Thaddeus Blight, your accounts have been presented. Your grievances meticulously articulated and cross-referenced against the temporal echoes of earthly records. We observe the entry of 12.5 acres by surveyor Cuthbert Finchley. A pattern of instrumental error in his surveys has been identified across multiple spatial temporal coordinates, confirmed by the echoes of later, more accurate living measurements. The superior foreign malting barley classification by Assessor Percival Grubbins is noted. A consistent pattern of misinterpretation of visual criteria for revenue maximization rather than factual accuracy has been universally observed in his earthly career, further confirmed by the testimony of spectral maltsters from neighboring temporal streams. The imputation of the Duke of Ravenswood's evaded liabilities upon your person is unequivocally recorded. The true financial karma of Duke Alaric of Ravenswood, a debt of significant negative numerical value, has been reattributed to its rightful source within the cosmic ledgers. Thaddeus gasped, a soundless spectral exhalation. It was happening. The loophole, the truth, finally acknowledged. The voices continued, their harmony deepening. The hat tax, candle tax, and epitaph length tax, as applied to your earthly existence, are noted as examples of a prevailing earthly crown policy of revenue generation without proportional regard for the tangible realities of economic activity or human dignity. These impositions, while lawful by temporal decree, are found to be numerically unjust in their broader spiritual application, particularly when they lead to the silencing of truth and the misrepresentation of a soul's true value. A profound, shimmering light enveloped Thaddeus Blight. He felt the centuries-long weight lift from his spectral shoulders, not abruptly, but with the smooth, satisfying finality of a perfectly balanced ledger. The phantom aches of the phantom acres faded. The bitter taste of superior foreign barley dissolved. The stain of the Duke's unpaid dues vanished, leaving his spectral form clean, unblemished. His moans, which had been the ceaseless, automatic expression of his continuous suffering, softened, then transformed. They were no longer sounds of lament, but deep, contented sighs, sighs of release, sighs of perfect numerical equilibrium. The final deduction is made. Thaddeus Blight, the auditors intoned, their voices filled with a solemn, harmonious resonance. Your personal ledger, once grievously misaligned by earthly error and cynical application of figures, is now balanced. Your eternal financial karma is declared not one of debt, but of rectitude, earned through your persistent, if monotonous, pursuit of numerical truth. The burden of unacknowledged error is lifted. You are free to pass beyond the veil, to find your true rest in the infinite, unquantifiable peace that awaits beyond all earthly ledgers. Thaddeus Blight, the ghost that only moaned about taxes, felt a sense of profound, quiet contentment settle upon him, a feeling far more satisfying than any earthly refund. His very essence seemed to expand, no longer bound by the specific grievances of 17th century fiscal policy, but by the universal truth of numbers. He was still Thaddeus, the maltster, but he was also, finally, simply Thaddeus at peace. He looked back at the luminous auditors, their forms shifting, already moving on to the next cosmic account, the next numerical dilemma. He had done it. He had achieved the ultimate audit, the final, irrefutable deduction. The spectral currents returned, but this time, they were not pulling him back to the purgatory of earthly tax offices, nor to the dreary routine of the afterlife exchequer. They carried him gently, serenely, towards an opening of pure, infinite light, a light that hummed with the comforting certainty of perfectly balanced equations. His moans, now soft whispers of release, drifted behind him, echoes of a burden finally shed. He was no longer the ghost that only moaned about taxes. He was Thaddeus Blight, the ghost who found his balance, finally moving on to where no tax collector, no faulty chain, and no misplaced decimal point could ever trouble him again. The ultimate deduction had been made, and the ledger, for one humble malster, was finally, truly, and eternally at peace.